elaborate a little bit more on what that looks like? And I think you said something about people having fear to call 911 in the past, like where that is coming from and what the efforts have looked like that OUC has been involved in.
So in my PSA, there have been times that I call 911 every day and maybe 2 or 3 times a day because of the illicit activity that was occurring in our neighborhoods. And there has been this fear in our community for quite some time that when you call 911, they can see your name, your address, and your phone number. And then there have been times when police officers were sent to our homes. So even though something awful may be happening and you should call 911, people are most likely not to. So over the years, I've talked to the different directors about this, and Karima Holmes was actually the most responsive when she was here. And as a result of our connection, I had 3 meetings at 3 different communities where they sent a representative out to let us know that if you have fear of calling 911, you can send a text. I didn't know that. And they tried to assure the community that nobody is at liberty to send the police. A dispatcher is not at liberty to send the police to your home unless you ask them to. So the community engagement is helping us to confront the fear and to start to develop a sense of trust with the dispatchers when we call 911. Was that helpful?
Yes, thank you. No, that's very helpful. And just to make sure I'm understanding this properly, beforehand, police officers were going to the home of the person who called, even if the incident was not at that person's home?
Yes, and then I also found out from MPD that they only do what the dispatchers tell them to do. They don't just arbitrarily show up at your house. But if the dispatcher shared that they should come to your house, and they come to your house. And I have to tell you, it happened to me on several occasions over the years, because if you're reporting illicit activity, you don't want folks to know that you're the ones that call the police. And then if the police show up at your house, then that can make you a target.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's very useful. Ms. Seegers, you talked about the kind of importance of supporting our police officers. And as we think about the role of the Deputy Mayor's office and their performance over the past year, in what ways do you think that their office has been helpful in that mission to support our officers, or has kind of room for improvement to share that message of support more broadly?
You say in your office or the
in the Deputy Mayor's office?
Oh, okay. Well, for one, when we have press conferences for a murder, I think sometimes they should come and be in that conference just to be seen, if nothing else, to show that they do care. I don't know how often the last people met with the chief, but I never heard him or the commander speak of that office at all. It seemed like to me they should meet enough, or somebody in the office, not necessarily the lead, but somebody should meet with them often enough to know exactly what's going on, and the police can tell them what's going on. Because now I don't know who write their speeches, but the speeches in the past, it didn't cover the police department too much. So I think they should work closer together, because they're the ones who kind of keep this community together. Where's Brenda? When they do right, not the ones they send to their homes, but they're the ones that really keep this community together. All the other organizations, they're kind of like a sidebar or a side dish, but the police are the ones who really keep it together. And I hope the council and the new person work closer with them and listen to them, because they have a lot to say. They're out here all the time dealing with the public and whoever else is out here. And I have called the police, and in the old days, they used to send the police to your home, but now they ask, at least when I call, they ask if I want them to come to the house. And I always say yes, I don't care, because somebody needs to know who's doing it. and they know to go someplace else. So I do tell them come here. Hey, Rachel. Yes, that's my response.
Well, thank you very much. And we do certainly rely on the police's insights and partnership. Ms. Houston, you talked about the Medicaid funding and how the White House is urging states to do this. Do you know if other states have moved forward or if DC has taken any steps to follow that instruction or guidance to access these Medicaid funds for VI programming?
Yeah, so as far as I know, Connecticut, California, and Illinois have led on it, and now New Jersey and Maryland are working their way through the process to get it started there. I've spoken with folks in Illinois to learn lessons about how they set it up so that we can do it correctly here. I testified at the Department of Healthcare Finance more in depth about it, and I can send you that testimony if you want. I know there's been at least one meeting in DC about it, but I don't know that it's moving forward expediently.
Got it. Okay. Well, I definitely plan to ask the deputy mayor about that later today, and hopefully will be another great avenue of funding at our disposal.
As the ARPA dollars sunset, it's a really important source of funding for this work. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Broderick, I want to ask you a little bit more about local control of our parole and kind of where we are in the process from your perspective. There is sometimes difference of opinion around where we are, where we should be, and strategy to do that most effectively given the current makeup of Congress. And from your perspective, wondering kind of how we can get there by October with the current reality of where we are in the process.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see if there's, if there's a will to do it. It certainly can get done. It's a question of, just realistically speaking, there are two schools of thought. The courts, some say the courts should do it, but the court just doesn't have the staff or the will to do it. And so what that leaves is perhaps having the court continuing to do the second chance work, but for the most part, setting up a parole authority and identifying individuals, a broad range of individuals to serve and to take on this work, identifying space. And so, it's way past time to move forward aggressively to do that and to get help from competent, knowledgeable consultants to assist. Olinda Moyd, for example.
Sorry, say that name again.
Olinda Moyd.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that. And I agree with you that is a very important next step for our city and many of our goals, but in making sure that we can connect people to the services here in DC when they return and help them get connected to our community again. So thank you. I look forward to working with you on that this year. Mr. Brown, thank you for sharing your experiences, and I'm sorry to hear that your ideas haven't been kind of met with collaboration, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to articulate some of what those may be. If you have other ideas that you'd like the Deputy Mayor's office to be focused on this year when it comes to improving public safety.
One of the things that I would like is to make sure that the members of the community are included in any plans that are designed to support the community. We're out of the brick and mortar areas where you can say, oh, that's just Mayfield, that's Paradise. We have individuals in our community that are very impactful and resolving crime. We just need to make sure that we focus on the empowerment piece, the empowerment piece. Solutions is going to come from within, and if we can build those. I'm sorry, I got a dog here. If we could just, if we can build those collaborations. I'm sorry, give me just 1 second. If we can build those collaborations from within the community and share them and our quality of life, connect people to their reality, then resources, instead of trying to bring a box of resources to the community. This is a one-size-fits-all program. It doesn't work. There's so many lanes and so much room for the betterment and the betterment of this community through collaboration. And we cannot move forward if we have a deputy director of public safety who has a hard time working with MPD, who has a hard time working with this agency, and definitely having a hard time addressing and respecting the quality of life concerns from the community. I have some written proposals, and I have the email address of your staffer, and I would definitely send it to them.
Great, thank you so much. Look forward to reading those. And Ms. DeBarros, thank you so much for being here. I think that there is a lot of important intersectionality between the needs of the business community and the need to improve public safety for all DC residents. And I know you've highlighted specifically downtown, where we've seen a reduction in occupancy and other concerns that may all be related. And we have to do something differently now because we're going to see this impact a few years from now. I'm hoping you can elaborate a little bit more on the importance of retail kind of eyes on the ground for some of we've been seeing with security, and kind of why that's so important to the business community and to our public safety goals more broadly.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, given that the foot traffic in downtown has changed so significantly, particularly the downtown area, as well as the Golden Triangle, those two neighborhoods, the bids are really working on how to go forward with that. When you lose that foot traffic and the people, on the streets, there's great opportunity for crime in those areas if there's not people there. So I think what we're hearing from our retail brokers is that the need to have police presence is important during this time. And I think, as we talked about in our testimony, going forward, as we have such a big task in front of us for downtown with construction, it takes years to do construction. I think that's a focus we should look towards going into this year, next year.
Got it. Okay. Would definitely agree with you there. We're going to be working on that with you. Well, thank you all very much to everybody on this panel. And as a reminder, if you haven't already, to please send your testimony to the committee so we can have that for the record. But appreciate you all being here. We are going to move on to our second panel for today. We will hear from Anya Kreider from Council for Court Excellence, Natalie Otero, co-founder and executive director of DC Safe, Pranav Nanda, public witness, Mike Velasquez from SMD 6A02, and Katie Hodge from DC chapter of Moms Demand Action. And Ms. Kreider, if you are on, please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Good morning, Councilmember Pinto and other members of the Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety. My name is Anya Kreider, and I'm the Open Horizon Criminal Justice Fellow at the Council for Court Excellence. CCE is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with the mission to enhance justice in the District of Columbia. Please note that per our policy, no judicial member of CCE participated in the formulation or approval of this testimony. This testimony does not reflect the specific views of or endorsement by any judicial member of CCE. I'm here today to testify about the importance and urgency of restoring local control of parole. This past year, the district missed an opportunity to take a critical step towards increasing criminal legal system autonomy and undoing historic and current racial disparities in the district's criminal legal system. Despite receiving a 2-year extension in 2020 on the U.S. Parole Commission, which has jurisdiction over individuals convicted of D.C. code violations, the district failed to make meaningful progress towards restoring local control of parole. Now, given the current state of congressional politics, the path to restoring local control of parole to the district has become much more arduous. Note that for the sake of simplicity in this testimony, we refer to a parole board, but recognize that DC may seek to structure its authority differently than the traditional and frequently criticized model of parole boards in the US. In 2022, the district terminated its contract with local experts employed to develop a plan to take back the control of parole in favor of a Virginia contracting firm. The firm has since also ended its work with the district. This past November, as the USPC was slated to sunset, Mayor Muriel Bowser requested more time to develop and fund the necessary infrastructure to take back local control of parole. In December 2022, Congress reauthorized the USPC for 1 year, giving the district yet another opportunity to regain autonomy over parole. We cannot continue to delay the district's responsibility to take control as if there were no consequences for our residents, and the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice must be at the forefront of leading this effort. The district has the opportunity to create a paroling authority that recognizes the decades of damage inflicted upon the district's Black residents by a history that includes biased policing, harsh sentencing laws, aggressive prosecutions, restrictive parole grant policies, and punitive revocation procedures. The district will be able to establish a paroling authority with modern policies that better ensures justice and advances the rights and opportunities of returning citizens while making thoughtful public safety considerations. If designed and implemented correctly, the new paroling authority would introduce greater fairness through high-quality adjudication and due process, and create a system of release supervision that provides support for reentry, treatment for behavioral health issues, and emphasizes principles of restorative justice and reconciliation. Additionally, establishing a DC parole board will strengthen local autonomy within the district's justice system, since a board would be made up of people appointed by locally elected officials, and DC law would guide the qualifications of any hearing officers, administrative law judges, or decision makers on staff. It would be significantly more accountable to the district. The DC Council would have oversight over the board's performance, and the district would have budgetary authority over the board. While the board would have to be funded by local district dollars, estimates have been shown that the cost is feasible. The USPC has an annual budget of $13 million, but the Justice Policy Institute estimated in its December 2019 report titled Restoring Local Control of Parole to the District of Columbia that the annual budget of a parole board may be around $4 million after initial startup costs. While this is a modest budgetary investment, the benefits of restoring humanity and dignity to DC residents entangled in the parole system are significant. Rethink Justice DC and DC Reentry Task Force's principles for the creation of a new paroling authority includes recommendations about how to ensure this happens. Additionally, the District Task Force on Jails and Justice, through its Committee on Local Control, explored the most significant qualities of a new DC parole authority in detail, making recommendations to guide the district. Community feedback was compiled, the process has been outlined, and now DC leaders need to act and restore local control of parole. It is critical that the council work with the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice to craft a viable plan forward to establish a local paroling authority in DC. It is disappointing that advocates, including CCE, reached out to Deputy Mayor Arpaio weeks ago to meet with her for the purpose of discussing local control of parole with no reply. There must be active and immediate collaboration to make this transition a reality before next year. In short, we must have a locally established option before the U.S. Parole Commission sunsets in October 2023. This concludes my testimony. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Kreider. Next, we will hear from Natalie Otero, the co-founder and executive director of DCC. Go ahead when you're ready.
Hi, thank you, Chairperson Pinto and members of the committee. My name is Natalia Otero, and I am the co-founder and executive director of DC Safe. Since 2006, we have played a critical role in the city's public safety infrastructure as the only 24/7 crisis intervention agency for domestic violence. Last year, we received over 44,000 calls to our response line and 17,000 individual referrals. Of these referrals, over 70% are generated by MPD, and we ultimately served a record number of 11,657 clients and families. Given DC Safe's extensive partnership with both OVSJG and MPD, as well as other agencies under the public safety cluster, we wanted to be here today to officially welcome newly appointed Deputy Mayor Pia and also introduce one of our strategic priorities, the High Risk Domestic Violence Initiative, or the HRDVI. The HRDVI represents the district's efforts on both a micro and macro level to reduce and prevent domestic violence homicides. It is an important part of the public safety system, and we urge the council to recommit its investment, both fiscally and ideologically this year. The Deputy Mayor's Office has supported the HRDVI since 2009, when it was first established through a city administrator's order. The order broke down the two components of the HRDVI, the Lethality Assessment Project, also known as the LAP, the Domestic Violence Systems Review Team, or the DVSR. The LAP is one of DC Safe's flagship direct service programs in which we identify and triage emergency interventions for high-risk cases. Last year, we provided expedited and enhanced services for over 800 high-risk survivors. The DVSR is the more macro component of the HRDVI. It is designed to convene over 18 district agencies to regularly review cases and address systemic barriers. That said, the work of the DVSR has been stifled the past few years due to delays in the new city administrator's order, which is needed to ensure the personnel time and the investment for many of the participating city agencies. In the meantime, DC Safe has continued our strategic work despite the lack of full participation. Our lab program continues to be highly successful, and we have been working closely with MPD to address high-risk cases in which our standard lab process does not have a meaningful impact. For example, in cases in which multiple calls for service have occurred without any change in the cycle of violence. This work helped inform and create the new Critical Case Response Team, or the CCRT, which allows frontline staff working directly with individuals in imminent danger to bypass usual channels, which may be slow and ineffective, and instead request a conference call with DVSR participants to discuss and create a plan to address the immediate issues. We have used this process 3 times over the past 3 years and have been successful in reducing the harm and addressing underlying issues contributing to the ongoing violence. The new city administrator's order will formalize the CCRT protocol as part of the HRDVI and authorize the training and personnel time required to implement this project fully. Knowing this, we have worked to reorganize the DVSR so that when the city administrator order is effective, we can begin work immediately to fully implement the CCRT and more systemic case review process. Both OVSJG and MPD have been supportive of this plan, and we look forward to this next phase in our partnership with both agencies to ensure the highly effective survivor-centered response continues for those district residents who find themselves in extremely high-risk situations. We're asking today that the Deputy Mayor's support the Deputy Mayor's support in expediting the new city administrator's order. As a member of the city's homicide elimination task force and someone who has been doing this work in this community for nearly 20 years, I can tell you firsthand how critical it is that the cities renew its investment in the HRDVI, both fiscally and ideologically. During the pandemic, we saw more domestic violence homicides than we had over the last decade. Without a named commitment from the city, we fear that the HRDVI will become more and more subject to the kind of benign ignorance that will ultimately deteriorate the systems, mechanisms, and partnerships that we have all worked so hard to develop since 2009. Thank you so much for your attention to this aspect of our work, and I look forward to questions.
Great, thank you so much. Circle back at the end of the panel. Next, we will hear from Pranav Nanda, public witness.
Good morning, Chairperson Pinto and members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify. My name is Pranam Nanda. I am a community member and a resident of Ward 6. I want to start my testimony by acknowledging my frustration. I'm frustrated that we go through this performance oversight cycle every year just to come back the next year to talk about the same issues that weren't addressed and propose the same solutions that were not implemented. I'm frustrated that instead of working together to make the city safer, elected officials and political leaders rehash the same political disagreements every single year. And most of all, I am frustrated that while all this goes on, members of our community continue to suffer. This has been said plenty of times before, but it warrants repeating. DC is resource rich, but coordination poor. That is not because DC lacks a plan to address public safety. It is because there is a lack of commitment to follow that plan. Over the past few years, community members, practitioners, experts have analyzed the public safety ecosystem in DC and provided numerous recommendations to improvement. Many of these organizations have testified today. All of these efforts generally align on three central beliefs. To improve public safety, we need to move away from the reliance on the carceral system, substantially expand community-based systems of care, and finally, make transformative investments in the community. Yet despite this, the mayor and frankly the council have taken very few steps to implement the strategies that have been recommended, and in many ways we continue to double down on the failed and harmful carceral rhetoric and policies that have contributed to the vast inequities and cycles of harm and violence that we see today. I implore this committee to hold the deputy mayor and all agencies in the public safety and justice cluster accountable for actually implementing these strategies and recommendations to improve public safety so that we're not back here next year talking about the same issues and the same strategies. In my remaining time, I want to voice my strong support for the council's decision to phase out SRO from DC public schools. I think this is an example of what I was just talking about. Instead of rehashing the same conversation for the third year in a row, I implore members of this committee to hold the deputy mayor, the mayor, and other key agencies accountable for working with school leaders, educators, families, and most importantly, students to build schools where all students feel safe and welcome. This means ensuring schools are properly staffed, ensuring programs such as DC Safe Passage and the ones Leader of Syrup Academy are expanded, and dismantling systems that lead to the criminalization of gangs. I firmly believe that community members have repeatedly articulated specific plans on how to improve community safety in DC. It is now the responsibility of this committee and the Deputy Mayor of Public Safety and Justice to help coordinate carrying out those plans, make the sustained investments in systems of care and in the community that will lead to this transformational change. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Fernando. Next, we will hear from Mike Velasquez from SMD 6A02. You here? Okay. Then we will move on to the last person on this panel, Katie Hodge from the DC chapter of Moms Demand Action. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Good morning to everybody. My name is again Katie Hodge. I am a volunteer with the DC chapter of Moms Demand Action. I'm a 30+ year resident of the district, almost all in Ward 6, where I live between the Potomac Gardens and Hopkins Apartments south of Pennsylvania Avenue. Gunshots are part of my community. They've been part of my community since before the crisis of the pandemic. If we do not keep focus on violence reduction, they'll continue to be in my community well after most people's attention has moved on. I would like to take a moment to recognize Lindsay Appiah's recent appointment as the acting Deputy Mayor of Public Safety and Justice. She made time to talk to me after a Twitter exchange last year, and I know she is aware that public safety and justice starts well before and long after a criminal act. Moms Demand Action continues to advocate for the implementation of a strategic gun violence prevention plan across all of district government. We appreciate the methodical and steady progression of building on the work that the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council has done in gun violence prevention. from their landscape analysis, gun violence problem analysis, to the gun violence reduction strategic plan released last year. Most social problems require a whole of government approach. Having this plan is important to coordinate across many agencies. Having benchmarks and metrics are key to ensuring district resources are used properly. We also advocate the sharing progress is an important part of transparency and accountability that is necessary to build public trust. I would say that I am part of creating plans in my professional work. Very often plans sit on a shelf to collect dust that devalues all the work and time that went into making the plan. Working from the plan will also help ensure that the district is elevating transformation and prevention measures alongside the immediate actions of intervention and response. The Office of the Deputy Mayor of Public Safety includes many agencies with an obvious impact on violence. We look forward in the coming years to see continued cooperation with the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services, whether through the community response teams, partnerships with MPD and 911 call diversion, or the work of the Department of Behavioral Health to heal trauma. There is power in what these offices can achieve together to address public safety and well-being in the District of Columbia. Digressing a moment from my official testimony, I can also say that the DC chapter has many volunteers for whom hospital-based violence prevention has become a personal passion as we've reviewed the evidence and impact that this can have on people's lives. And if there is some way as volunteers, because all of our chapter are volunteers, that we can support or provide public education, whatever, into the Medicare idea and promoting violence intervention, we would be very happy to participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hodgson. That's a great offer. And we will give that some thought into how to help empower you with that information to continue your wonderful volunteer efforts. Thank you very much. I do have some questions for folks. I can kind of go in order how you testified. So Anya Kreider, you talked a lot about local control and the kind of need to act quickly. And as we think about performance oversight with the Deputy Mayor's Office, the former Deputy Mayor Geldart is not here today to respond to comments, but in your view, how did the Deputy Mayor perform when it came to being a leader, a needed leader on getting local control of our parole? And how can we do a better job of that in the next year?
Thank you for your question. I think there's a real concern about the lack of cooperation with local advocates. I know Ms. Broderick mentioned Linda Moyd, who was somebody that the district had been working with on developing those plans, and good progress was made with her and another local expert, but then those ties were cut in favor of a national firm that didn't have expertise in this area, that didn't have local ties. So really, I think building those relationships and continuing where that work left off is something that we would love to see from Deputy Mayor Paya.
Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to working with you on that this year. Natalie Otero, thank you so much for all of the work that you do. And I'll just say, addressing the needs of our domestic violence survivors is one of the top priorities of this committee. And it is why we've asked for additional funding from the mayor's proposed budget, both for caseworkers and training and pay, and also for additional beds that we see continued needs for. And so I'm definitely looking forward to working with you on expanding those much needed services for our survivors, and hoping you can talk a little bit more about the HRDVI program and kind of next steps to ensure it's a success in ways that the Deputy Mayor's Office can be supportive or that the committee can be supportive.
Yes, actually, I would really like to support what one of the panelists was saying. I think it's Nanda Pranav. I think that we actually have a lot of intellectual prowess in the district in terms of like what advocates are doing. So there's a lot of work going on the ground with advocates and organizations that is crucial to this idea of public safety. And I think there's a lot of advocates that have been doing that and organizations that have programming that have been really involved in this for many years and have evolved their programming. I think the HRDVI is really unique in the sense that it is a multidisciplinary partnership. It is extremely powerful that both nonprofits, local city agencies, and federal agencies would come to the table together and discuss systems reform and share information and actively participate in case review and intervene in cases. So I think that the groundwork is there. I think what is really needed is both an ideological support from the city, meaning that a lot of these agencies have the will, but don't always have the resources to do the work on the ground. And so I think step one would be this renewing the city's commitment through this office by signing the updated city administrator's order that actually has been through council and has been discussed, and it should be ready. We've been working on this now for, I want to say, the better part of a year and a half. And so I think that's number one. And I think the other thing is recognizing that there needs to be more conversation about bringing the people doing the work to the table when the city is having conversations around how to engage with victims of crime, with survivors, with advocates. I think those are the two things that I think are really important to us moving forward.
Okay, thank you so much. I see we have been joined both by my Ward 4 colleague, Councilmember Louis George, and also our last public witness on this panel. Please forgive us, we were just able to promote you as a panelist. And so, Mr. Velasquez, if you would like to provide your testimony now, you can do so, and then I will turn to Councilmember Louis George if you have any opening statement or questions for these public witnesses.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm having tech issues and just want to make sure you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning, Chair Pinto, members of the staff and committee. My name is Mike Velasquez, and I'm grateful to be the newly elected commissioner for 6A02. Chair Pinto, congratulations on your selection to chair this very important committee. And I'd also like to thank Councilmember Allen, who is my council member, for his previous leadership on this committee and has now selected to chair the Transportation Committee. If you've ever been to the bus stops at 8th and 8th Street Northeast, you quickly realize the intersection of public safety and public transportation. Deputy Mayor Paya, congratulations on your appointment. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to represent the views of my constituents and those of neighboring districts. I'm testifying today at the Deputy Mayor's hearing because the issues I raise require coordination among agencies, the same coordination Mr. Nanda mentioned has been absent. The backbone of 6A02 is the 8th Street Northeast corridor from 7th to 13th Street Northeast. Using very rough math, that means I represent about 50% of the 8th Street Northeast corridor and its adjacent residents. To be sure, I'm not alone in representing 8th Street, and I'm thankful for the partnership of Commissioners Kelty, Chatterjee, and Dooling, as well as the leadership of the many citizens and business owners working to make a difference in our community. On Monday morning, I awoke to a text from an 8th Street restaurant owner. Quote, "How safe do you feel with something like that happening literally 200 feet from your house?" The next one read, "Or my staff right in front of the restaurant." And then another, "Why don't the business owners know who the beat cops are anymore?" Sadly, late Sunday night, a man was murdered in the parking lot of the AutoZone at 1207 8th Street Northeast after being involved in an argument lasting for several minutes, perhaps 20 to 30 minutes, according to a neighbor who called the police non-emergency line. Simply put, business and residences are frustrated by the staffing levels in the 1st District. Their desperation is causing them to make the difficult decision to leave our great city. The staffing gap also places great strain on the officers and on our tireless leaders, Commander Tasha Bryant and Captain Sherelle Williams, who both face never-ending calls to provide a police presence at the latest hotspot. The problem is there are more hotspots than officers to be present, to be engaged in preventing crime. 1st District is certainly not alone, and MPD and the district are not alone in their police recruiting and retention challenges. However, this committee has provided MPD with the tools to increase its roles, and Chief Conti's data shows a persistent shortfall. I request this committee probe the use of recruiting and retention incentives given to the Office of the Deputy Mayor and MPD. Is there a way to change our recruiting approach? Let's get aspirational. Many of the officers I've met in the 1st District consciously chose MPD over NYPD and moved here from New York. Let's make DC the city of choice for aspiring urban police officers. We need to win this fight for talent. Our lives depend on it. I'd like to shift gears figuratively and perhaps literally too to talk about dangerous vehicles. Vehicles that regularly exceed the speed limit and accumulate thousands of dollars in unpaid fines in vehicles with fraudulent fake tags. During the holidays last year, a 15-year-old boy was shot in broad daylight near Eastern High School. The car carrying the shooter had at least 10 tickets for exceeding the speed limit, and in some cases for driving more than 25 miles per hour over the speed limit. These aren't hardworking folks who are late for work. Ask any patrol officer and they'll tell you they see upwards of 10, 15, or 20 temp tags per shift cruising our streets and avoiding detection of their true identities and ownership. One recent report indicates crime using fake tags is up some 300%. If we can immobilize these cars before they are headed to an armed robbery, an assault with a deadly weapon, or a shooting, we can make a marked impact on crime. At a January public safety forum for ANC commissioners held by Mayor Bowser, she artfully dodged my request to equip and train police to find these cars and redirected my question to the city administrator. I don't blame the mayor for reminding me that she's focused on guns, but I think she missed my point. Many times, this is how the guns get to the crime. Just this Monday afternoon, a planned routine traffic stop on 12th Street Northeast turned into 4 juveniles bailing out of the car and running from police. Thanks to the mindful and courageous efforts of 1D and 5D officers, the occupants of the stolen car were apprehended, very likely before they got to the site of their next planned crime. And the couple who owned this Kia got their car back. Simply put, vehicle enforcement disrupts crime before it happens. Using special sensors mounted on their vehicles, patrol officers can spot stolen cars. I asked this committee to direct the Deputy Mayor and DPW to have MPD use sensors to detect and boot cars with numerous excessive speeding tickets or with fraudulent tags. Doing so will disrupt the cycle of crime.
Mr. Velasquez,
yes,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're very over your time. If I could ask you to kind of summarize and wrap up.
I have 2 sentences left.
Okay.
I understand the mayor's budget includes 3 sentences. I understand the mayor's budget includes $1 million to increase the number of booting crews. I'll be back for the budget hearing because that's not enough. Finally, I asked this committee to also take a look at 2 pieces of legislation introduced last year, the ATV Effectiveness Amendment Act and the Reckless Driver Accountability Act. Thank you for your time and for the extra time.
Thank you very much. And while I have you, tell me about the ATV effectiveness piece that you're interested in.
Sure. There was legislation introduced last year called the Automatic Traffic Enforcement Effectiveness Amendment Act, which helps, it sets a particular standard with which DPW would boot cars and not allow folks to renew their licenses. I would also like to take the opportunity to say, what we're doing today is not automated traffic enforcement. We're merely notifying most drivers of the fact that they committed a crime. We're not really enforcing it if we're not asking them to pay their fines. And I'm particularly concerned about cars where I live. I'm particularly concerned about cars from Maryland and Virginia who come through our city and have reckless disregard for our citizens, the youth, and the elderly.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Nanda, you talked about your frustration of there being a plan and not implementing it. And can you elaborate on what plan you're referring to specifically?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I would say it's not like one singular plan, but we've been having the same conversations about the same issues and proposing solutions. So there's the Jails and Justice Task Force that Ms. Broderick already talked about. There's the Police Reform Commission report. There's the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform's Gun Violence Reduction Strategic Plan. CJCC has come out with numerous studies, including a study of the factors that affect the likelihood of the juvenile justice system involvement. So like, we've had these plans, these proposals, these recommendations. So my feeling is it's not that we don't know what works. We have the data, we have the evidence, we have the like the plans, the proposals. It is now about the implementation, and I feel like we've been having that same conversation year in, year out, and acting like we just don't know what to do. And in my opinion, I think what that ends up happening is we throw our hands up and go back to the same carceral solutions, which I said, we know don't work, but it's, I think we just kind of revert back to that, although it contributes to the inequities and the cycle of harm we're seeing. So I think it's now just a question about actually really committing to what we're doing. Again, I gave the example of police-free schools. That vote happened in 2020. It is now 2023, and we're still talking about that same political discourse instead of talking about, okay, we've made that decision. How can we work with students, with educators, with school leaders to put in alternative systems while we phase that out to really make schools welcoming for kids? So that is kind of what I was thinking about.
Got it, understood. And I think, all of these issues are so challenging in part because not everybody does agree on the best path forward. And so there can be a lot of thought going into what the plan should look like, but then a change in leadership or a change in one of the key partners can shift that. And when it comes to SROs, I think that's a good example too of hearing from more members of the community about something after it happens. And we try to have, a robust legislative process that makes sure everybody in the public is aware of what's going on and they can be invited to the hearings and invited to be part of that process. But in reality, sometimes they don't hear about it until afterwards. And I think it's also our obligation to be responsive to those we hear from the community about concerns they have about something that we may have already done, and making sure that we're being responsive to that. But thank you, and I hear you. And thank you to all of our public witnesses today. That concludes our public witnesses for the deputy mayor. And I will now call our government witness, Lindsay Appiah, acting deputy mayor for public safety and justice. Welcome. And it is the tradition of this committee to swear in all of our government witnesses who appear before it. So if you can please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of law that the testimony you are about to provide before the Council of the District of Columbia and this committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Great. Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Acting Deputy Mayor Appiah to make any opening statement you may have at this time.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Chairperson Pinto, members and staff of the Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety. I am Lindsay Appiah, Acting Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice. Thank you for this opportunity to offer testimony on the performance of the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice during fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023 to date. I look forward to working with you, Chairperson Pinto, and this committee to advance us towards a safer, more just city for all our residents in all 8 wards. While I am new to this acting role, I am no stranger to the district government, or the public safety and justice cluster. I first moved to DC in 2001 to attend law school at Georgetown University Law Center and have called the city home for 17 of the last 22 years. I've been deeply privileged to serve my fellow DC residents since 2012 when I joined the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, DYRS, serving in several capacities, including General Counsel and Interim Director. I joined the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice as Chief of Staff in 2021. My love for this city makes it a tremendous privilege and honor to be nominated in January by Mayor Bowser, for whom I have the utmost respect, to serve as her Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice. The DMPSJ office is tasked with providing direction, guidance, support, and coordination to the district's public safety agencies to develop and lead interagency public safety initiatives to improve the quality of life for in the district's neighborhoods. Mayor Bowser has set clear priorities. We must reduce crime, gun and juvenile violence, and every agency in the PSJ cluster has a role in advancing these priorities. Enhancing the safety of our residents in all 8 wards is one of the most pressing responsibilities we have as a government. Under my leadership, my office will outline a clear vision and implement a framework to reduce overall crime, provide a host of information, interventions, and whole of government strategies to inform how we communicate about public safety to various stakeholders, including the public, press, and council, and communicate clearly the role of the PSJ agencies in the public safety and justice ecosystem. The 12 agencies of the public safety and justice cluster include the Department of Corrections, Department of Forensic Sciences, Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, Fire and Emergency Management Services, Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, Mayor's Office on Returning Citizens Affairs, the Metropolitan Police Department, Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Office of Human Rights, Office of Unified Communications, Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants, and the Safer, Stronger DC Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. The missions of these agencies are dynamic, complex, yet interconnected. Each plays a critical role in the overall health and functioning of our public safety and justice ecosystem. The cluster's interconnectedness is centered around prevention, intervention and enforcement, accountability, and rehabilitation. Prevention includes those non-law enforcement and programs, services, and strategies aimed at decreasing the incidence of individuals committing violent crime and in reducing community conditions that lead to high rates of violent crime in communities in our city. It encompasses our work in providing coordinated delivery of wraparound services and connecting our residents and their communities to care. This category includes, but is not limited to, the work of D.F.S credible messengers, ONE's violence interrupters, FEM's hand-on heart CPR program, and OVSJG managing grants for victims ranging from domestic violence to sexual assault. Intervention and enforcement are primarily our law enforcement strategies led by MPD. MPD currently has the lowest force strength that it's had since before 1999. Mayor Bowser has long maintained that MPD needs 4,000 officers. With increases in crimes involving guns and the types of criminal activity present in our city, we need a force that is strong and agile with adequate staffing resources. Prevention programs intend to strengthen, empower, and engage people to keep them safe and healthy before they engage in risky behavior. These efforts include approaches aimed at reducing factors associated with at-risk problematic behaviors and strengthening protective factors. They can be directed towards youth and young adults generally, or more specifically directed towards at-risk populations within the community. Intervention programs, on the other hand, target individuals already engaged in at-risk behavior, including gang or antisocial group membership. Accountability includes the criminal justice system. Holding people appropriately accountable for their behavior is critical to future deterrence. Currently, the district's criminal justice system is functioning at a diminished capacity. The DC Superior Court is down 8 judges. While case processing is improving, it is still slower than pre-pandemic, and the courts must contend with the backlog. Our role in accountability is ensuring the strength of systems that support the timely, fair, and equitable processes and outcomes for victims and perpetrators. An accountability example includes rebuilding the Department of Forensic Sciences and its ability to process evidence. Rehabilitation includes those strategies aimed at helping restore the individual that has committed harm and the community that has been harmed, so that they no longer find themselves in the perpetual loop of criminal activity. This category includes providing reentry services to returning citizens. We are committed to supporting returning citizens through programs like MORCA's partnership with the Department of For-Hire Vehicles in the Promise Rides initiative, which offers clients up to 5 free cab rides a week to re-entry related appointments. Our ecosystem has many pain and pressure points. Gun violence has a devastating impact for the victims and their families, but also more broadly by eroding our sense of public safety. Reducing gun violence is one of the Bowser administration's highest priorities. The district has invested significant resources into a multi-pronged public safety approach that invests in law enforcement, prevention efforts, youth programming, rehabilitation, and reentry. Every day, critical and noble work happens throughout the PSJ agencies, resulting in an essential fact. Overall crime continued to decrease during fiscal year 2022, as it did during the previous years of the Bowser administration. However, what has increased over time is gun-involved crime and homicides. And we know that these increases are fueling anxiety and fear in our residents. There is nothing more foundational to human flourishing than the need to be safe and the need to feel safe. With that in mind, during the past fiscal year and this fiscal year to date, DMPSJ coordinated interagency cross-cluster initiatives which have demonstrated outcomes of reducing crime and increasing presence in our neighborhoods. The Multi-Agency Nightlife Task Force brings a whole of government approach to address identified violent crime, quality of life, nuisance activities, and regulatory concerns that were occurring in 3 identified nightlife areas: U Street Northwest, H Street Northeast, and the Connecticut Avenue Northwest corridors. This team is focused on preventing violent crime, preventing operation of and seizing illegal ATVs operated on public space, ensuring businesses operate in compliance with regulatory statutes, addressing harmful traffic conditions, and reducing general disorder and criminal activity in these corridors. This task force has operated since June 2022 and contributed to a significant decrease in crime in each corridor. Between June and December 2022, there was a 28% decrease in total crime in the U Street corridor, a 20% decrease in total crime in the H Street corridor, and a 616% decrease in total crime in the Connecticut Avenue corridor. The Multi-Agency Public Safety Task Force supports law enforcement efforts in some of our most at-risk communities. In fiscal year 22, this task force supported the work of the Homicide Reduction Partnership Initiative, known as HRP, focusing on reducing violent crime within 4 police service areas, PSAs, throughout the entire 2022 calendar year. These areas included PSAs 603, 604, 706, and 708, which accounted for 21% of all of the murders citywide in 2021. The objective of the HRP was to use a whole of government approach to reduce violent crime, have a positive impact on the community's perception of safety and security, and increase trust among residents in the police and the DC government as a whole. The work of the task force contributed to a reduction in violent crime by 18% in 60 and 8% in 70 between 2021 and 2022. This effort was so notable that a DC government employee, a native of Ward 8, shared with me that he brought a family member to see the partnership at work because he had not seen that level of in-community coordination between district agencies. Additionally, DMPSJ partners with the Deputy Mayor for Education as operational lead for Safe Passage, a program that coordinates government and school resources to target specific areas of the city to improve student safety as they travel to and from school. Safe Passage workers are trusted adults assigned to priority areas who build relationships with school staff, students, families, and community members. DMPSJ is also leading the coordination of public safety GO teams, which are multi-agency teams consisting of more than 100 credible contacts, including violence interrupters from WONS and CURE, credible messengers from DYRS, and DPR roving leaders, working together to conduct outreach in community hotspots known for large gatherings and fireworks in order to promote safety. Safety GO teams deployed 3 times in 2022, 4th of July, Labor Day weekend, and Halloween. During the time in which the teams were deployed during 4th of July, there were 0 shootings in the 28 communities in which we had teams. Despite multiple shootings in other locations, only 1 shooting occurred in a GO team neighborhood, but that happened after the teams deactivated. Teams deactivated at 2 a.m. The shooting occurred after 3 a.m. Additionally, our DMPSJ resource pop-ups meet the needs of vulnerable residents, including at-risk youth and seniors. These pop-ups provide communities in the district with the tools necessary to increase safety in their respective communities and build trust among residents, DC government, and community organizations. We are bringing agencies and community organizations from across the district to provide information about programs offered, providing residents with an opportunity to meet and speak with agency and organization representatives, and encouraging residents to interact with and meet their neighbors. In summer 2022, DMPSJ launched 202 for Peace, a citywide gun violence campaign. It was designed to raise awareness about the services and programs available to DC residents vulnerable to violent activity and sought to increase community buy-in through messaging and activities targeted at engaging youth. Because of this work and more, we are making progress towards our ambitious but necessary public safety goals. As the mayor said, throughout fiscal year 2022, we are throwing everything at crime. We are investing in supporting our district agencies and their employees responsible for the coordinated effort to address crime in our city, and assuring our residents that we will continue to use every tool to increase public safety and help our residents feel safe. While there have been meaningful reductions in crime in 2022, there are still areas of great challenge. We have far too many people carrying and using illegal guns. Too many people are being shot. Bottom line, we have too many people acting without accountability for the terror they're inflicting in our communities. We are especially concerned about gun violence involving our juveniles. There were 105 juveniles shot in 2022, compared to 58 shot in 2021. Tragically, 16 juveniles were killed in 2022. Given the unique nature of youth crime, PSJ will work across clusters to address the conditions leading to juvenile violence. As stewards of public trust, it is critical that we are always evaluating the efficacy of our efforts and must be willing to scale back, assess, and scale up those programs and initiatives that are achieving the outcomes we wish to see. PSJ will pivot and redirect when necessary. We also must be excellent at our primary foundational agency functions. We have robust, evidence-based public health and traditional public safety resources, tools, and interventions aimed at reducing crime. When coordinated, we can prevent violence. In fiscal year 2023, PSJ will continue to prioritize coordination, collaboration, and transparency. We will be accountable to meeting our residents' reasonable expectations of excellence in meeting and delivering of our agency missions. And we will continue to work tirelessly to ensure that our residents in all 8 wards and visitors are safe and feel safe. Thank you for your time and for this opportunity to testify about DMPSJ's performance. I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Deputy Mayor. And let me start by saying officially congratulations on your new role. And I'm really looking forward to working together with you to solve many of the challenges that we continue to see in our city. And I know the great concern for those challenges that we both share.
Yeah.
So I want to start with what I think, and you highlighted as one of the most pressing issues facing our city, which is violent crime and gun violence. And I want to specifically start with your and the mayor's vision for concrete steps that we can take in 2023 to reduce gun violence. As you commented on, we've spent the last several years building up these various alternative approaches to violent crime reduction, including the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, violence interruption programs, credible messengers, to name a few. And we have thrown a lot of resources at different initiatives, and it's been a little bit of an experiment in some ways. And some things may be working well, while others may need to be revisited. And one of the criticisms that I think you have said yourself, and we heard from some of our witnesses today, is that the city can tend to be resource rich and coordination poor, which I hope we can all strive to not have that be such a common trope we hear. But fortunately, we now have this document, the Gun Violence Reduction Strategic Plan, that looks at all the different programs that we have and lays out a roadmap for ensuring they can all work together. And I'm glad to see that your office seems to have engaged with the plan and used its recommendations as somewhat of a blueprint for guiding our overarching strategy. So can you start off by talking a little bit about the plan? How are you using the plan? Is it something you're consulting regularly? And how are you kind of following up with associated metrics to demonstrate success?
Sure. I think one of the things that we heard from, I think it was Mr. I don't want to get his name now wrong, Pranav. they listed a host of plans that we've had. And I think that one of the things that's very true about the district is even dating back to the mayor's first term in 2015, 2016, when we began the work on Safer, Stronger, where there really was a robust plan that came out of that. Much of what you'll see of the plans over time is that the frameworks of what works to address gun violence doesn't change. So in truth, the district has had a plan since 2016 Safer, Stronger plan. And so much of what you see in the progress that we've made in the NIJCR plan is because we had frameworks in place already, right? Like over time, you evaluate what's working. There are new developments. There are things that people find work better or worse. But fundamentally, the reason that we have made progress in implementing that plan, and we provided for your office a lot of the actions that we have taken, is because much of that work was at work. But this is hard work, right? Like it is not, gun violence is a challenging issue across our country. And so, you know, it's been 5 years, or I don't know, I guess 2016 is now 7 years. And we are making progress, as I said, but certainly gun violence is a challenge. There's no and or. And so my perspective is it's not police or the alternatives, right? These are how we view it. And every plan that you see does back this up, and meeting with David Muhammad and all of this, right? Like in engaging with local experts and others, is policing has a role, and so does the host of prevention and public health tools, and they must work hand in hand. We have to get guns off of our streets. There's no question that no plan is going to be overly effective when you're flooded with guns, right? So we have to invest in ensuring that MPD is able to do that, right? Because they are a primary tool in removing guns. And then we also need to work together on the prevention side to ensure that we help to create conditions in which people don't use them, right? Because it doesn't always mean that simply because people have guns, which we don't want hands in the guns of juveniles or people unlawfully carrying weapons, but we also want to do the work to prevent them from using them. So I mean, there are so many specifics, right, like that we've outlined here, but I think one of the big things, and we don't love that phrase that we hear all the time, but we are so fortunate in the district to have so many resources that by and large, I don't think when we go kind of to these national spaces, we likely have some of the most robust tools of any locale, which is to our fortune. But I have this idea, and something I'm working on with our PSJ agency is this idea of a slingshot. Sometime to move forward, you need to pull back. And so we're in that process of looking at, I say this, we can love a program, right? And there are many reasons why we may continue to do a program that isn't necessarily showing, you know, in the outcomes what we'd like to see, because we know that with time or proper investment that might work. But we also have to be realistic that if programs are not showing outcomes that they should, we may need to really take a hard look at, do we need to continue investing in that way? And so that's the process that I'm saying now, is that we can't have 15 different plans, because having 15 different roadmaps means you are going in all different directions. And I think that in our earnestness to try and respond to all of these different crises, and being so fortunate to have so many experts in the District of Columbia, we do have a lot of plans. My goal is to help us to focus on the essentials, which haven't changed over time. And many of them things you'll see in Safer, Stronger are what you see in NIJCR and what you see in any plan.
Thank you. And that makes sense, but I guess when it comes to the gun violence reduction strategic plan, is it then accurate to say, instead of following that plan, you're taking a holistic look at all the plans that exist? Or is that your blueprint?
So we are taking a look at a number of the plans, right? Because there are things which this addresses. Number one, I'll say this, that when we go through this, the things in which the district is doing or has already done, right? You know, implement a comprehensive coordinated citywide gun violence reduction strategy. We recognize that we've started that we have an Office of Gun Violence Prevention, and we also have an Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. You already see us making moves in the executive to align and coordinate in a way that makes sense from operational and policy in appointing Director Harley Harper to oversee right, that space so that we're coordinating, right? There is the discussion of data-driven identification of those individuals and groups at highest risk. We have our drivers of gun violence list. We have been working on the People of Promise initiative and also with our other partners in the law enforcement space, CSOSA, PSA, MPD, to look at holistically how do we address the individuals on that list, and also how are we going about updating it, right, through what we know in kind of our own processes of identifying those who are most at risk, through our violence intervention workers, through community referrals, and then also through our own lens of what we know through law enforcement, right? So that's another piece of this. Intensive services, supports, and opportunities, right? We invest in, I think there's $119 million in FY23 in investment, sort of in a purely wraparound space, whether it's through OVSJG grants on specifically for those most at risk for gun violence, for trauma and mental health services, juvenile mental health services, short-term and medium-term housing, the investment in case managers and life coaches this year for ones, mediation services, community-based behavioral health, restorative justice circles. All of those investments that you see there are what we would say are intensive service supports and opportunities, as well as honestly the portfolio of services the district has, whether you are involved in gun violence or not, like workforce development programs at DOES, right? All of that fits in there. Focused law enforcement. Certainly we've talked about MPD and how they are doing, how we are working in the face of what are some true staffing challenges. You heard us talk about the Homicide Reduction Partnership Initiative, right? How can we get the most reductions with focused law enforcement and whole of government external partnerships. The citywide data system, right, that's in there. Those are things we've talked about. You know, I've been in this space 11 years. We have challenges, and there are ways we share data, and we regularly talk in the CJCC. Are there ways we can share data better? There, you know, we have a lot of laws and federal and local and many things that make that challenging, but it's an ongoing discussion. The real-time incident review. I'm just going through them just so that people, you know, to help contextualize where we are. We started, we had a number of coordination meetings that have been occurring since the Building Blocks Initiative launched with the EOC, but we've added some additional coordination. One's started back in November, where all of the credible contexts, CURE, hospital-based violence, DYRS, credible messengers have a weekly meeting where we're looking at specific cases to see where we are across, who's working what. And that's on top of a whole host of kind of other incident review processes and VI calls that occur. But that's our sort of I think that's our foray into, okay, like, can we add more of the credible contact continuum in to have conversations? And it's a work in progress, and I admit that. In the juvenile space, we brought in a consultant, I'll say Clint Lacey, right, to help us to look at our continuum to say, is there a way we can be more cohesive and get more efficiencies and effectiveness out of this wide range of credible context we have? Because we recognize we have a lot of different models. We have a lot of different entities. We have things in a lot of different umbrellas. And the way we get effectiveness, as I said, is everyone pulling in the same direction. And I do believe it's our role, my role as deputy mayor, to help us pull in the same direction. That wasn't the whole, I didn't go through all of them, but I wanted to.
No, I appreciate that. And that's helpful to hear kind of the more granular way you're thinking about some of those recommendations. And of course, some are a little bit more nebulous. And so we'll take filling in the gaps. I want to follow up though on something you just said about looking at the myriad of services and maybe needing to pull back on some. Are you thinking about that from a funding perspective, that some programs shouldn't be seeing the investments that they have in the past, or what do you mean by pulling back on some?
So it's not, funding is one piece, right? Like budgets obviously are about priorities, but like, and our priorities are clear. We need to reduce gun violence, and we also need to reduce crime across our city and make sure residents are safe. But what I mean is that we all have a role, including you, of making sure that as stewards of public trust and public dollars, that we set clear objectives and outcomes for what we're trying to achieve. That's true of our agencies, whether it's KPIs or individual programs and initiatives. And at some point, we do have to ask the question, are we achieving those outcomes? There are process measures that we also look at, right? Like there's, in this space, I know there are many qualitative measures and things that we look at, right? Like, are people feeling supported? Are people feeling loved? Are people feeling cared for? But then we have to also recognize, though, are we getting the outcomes we need, which is we do need to reduce violent crime. We do need to address certain populations. And so the process that we're going through right now is looking at that. I hear, and we know, that people call, one of the challenges in this space is people are like, we really don't know what's going on. And we talk about accountability. It's important that we are as accountable to our residents as we ask everybody in our system to be accountable. And that means we have to be able to produce data that shows outcomes and to be honest about what is and isn't working so that we can really be efficient and effective in our investments. And there may be different metrics by which we determine effectiveness. It's not all, hey, this had this, percent of reduction, but it can't all be qualitative, right? There has to be some quantitative outcomes here.
Completely agree with you there.
Yeah.
I'm happy that's a focus. I want to ask you about MPD staffing, because you talked about the staffing being some of the lowest it's been in years, if not decades.
Yeah.
How do you view your role in helping the police department get the additional staffing that they need? Because from many of my conversations with these officers or Chief Conti, it seems that we are having a hard time hiring and incentivizing people to do this very hard and important work. And so how do you plan to kind of change that trend?
Yeah, and so there's multiple ways and I think what is true of MPD is true of all of our agencies, because we have some critical vacancies across the cluster where public safety and actually, I'm speaking of public safety and justice, but I think if we're honest, right, like mental health providers, educators, right, like there are some critical vacancies across our country, and law enforcement is not an attractive profession right now. It is a noble profession. It is a necessary and critical profession, but there are many reasons why it is not viewed as highly attractive right now. And so my job is to do a few things, to make sure that we have all of the resources and to advocate that we have all the resources necessary to offer what you saw. Retention, we need to retain good officers once they're here and trained, to make sure that we are creatively thinking about what is attractive to a host of different types of people. Millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Z and millennials and down do not have the same things that are attractive to them as others. So an example of is take-home cars, which doesn't seem like a major budgetary piece. It was struck from last year's budget. It was one part of our proposal for recruitment incentives. But what MPD heard from the younger generation is they like take-home cars, which is why we make those type of proposals. So there's the piece of advocating for what is determined is working. So that's one thing. It's also, advocating to make sure we did things like we did the CD, getting our collective bargaining agreement in place, right? So that our officers who are working are taken care of. It also is doing some of the work we started doing, which is helping, pulling together a panel of individuals outside of MPD, right, in the recruiting space to help us think about and reimagine what it looks like to recruit, because MPD and most law enforcement outfits have traditional ways they recruit, and post-pandemic and post-2020 and all of that, many systems have changed. And so being in a position in our office supporting, I participated in that and will continue to think about, are there ways that we can recruit in different spaces? Are there things that are attractive to certain groups, right? Like we want to increase women. We have our 30 by 30 initiative. Are there incentives or otherwise like childcare or other things that we can offer that would be attractive to specific cohorts? It's more targeted recruiting than what they've done in the past. But we're having those conversations too to help think about more broadly. And also, how can we build the pipeline? We want district residents, right? So that's another thing is, you know, in FY25, we'll start to see some of the results of, you know, us building our cadet program. Are there other ways in which we can attract district residents and things that would be attractive? So it's all of that kind of 360 thinking with them to help us improve our force strength, which I will say, like, just because people often don't know the numbers, we're at 3,379. That is below in sort of our trajectory. The last time we had about 3,400 was 1999. It's always been about that. So that's where we are, just because people often don't really know. That's the reality. So that's as far back as we tracked was 1999. So
got it. No, I appreciate that and those different tools to utilize. We have been joined by our Ward 4 colleague, Councilmember Janice Lewis-George, and you will have a 15-minute round, Councilmember.
Thank you, Chairwoman Pinto, and good afternoon, or good morning. It's still morning. Good morning, Director. Director, first I want to make sure we, clarify your role, because I think some of the confusion sometimes is sort of the public's understanding of everybody's role within the public safety continuum. Sure. And so in a recent email exchange with my office and a Ward 4 residents, your office stated that your office is not the lead for coordinating across public safety agencies. And so I want to understand who is the lead for coordinating across public safety agencies.
So I don't know. I would have to look back at that email. We are certainly the lead for helping, coordination. When it comes to individual plans, I think there was a specific request for that neighborhood. We absolutely take and sit in the seat in helping to coordinate when it comes to public safety agencies. But when it's across, I think there was some questions about education. It kind of came out of things that were happening in education space, right? Mm-hmm. Like we certainly are not, we work together, but our lane is also the 12 agencies of public safety. And while we work together on initiatives like Safe Passages, when it comes to DPW or others, these are our partners, but we are not in a position to simply say, hey, this is going to be the plan and that this is what they'll do. So I think just like any, the executive, I can certainly always, as deputy mayor, work with our agencies to come up with a plan. But when it comes to external clusters, we work together, but I don't want to say that, right? Like that we're going to be able to say, hey, DPW, you all handle, right? Like there's a respect and there's a partnership, but not the oversight. So your office is your 12 agencies within your cluster, sort of coordination among those 12. And then if it's outside of sort of that cluster, then it would be best to say to go to Director Linda Harley Harper of she's one, but in her role as Office of Gun Violence. Yes, thank you. There we go. Office of Gun Violence Safety. I think it depends on what we're talking about, right? Because some things, if you're talking about gun violence specifically, that's PSJ, whether it's Linda as ones or Linda as OGBP. But some of the issues that are arising related to just general kind of, because you're going to have like that so I'm thinking DPW, DOB, like the agencies that are not DPR, these are not considered in your cluster, but are considered sort of a part of our public safety continue, like how we come together all. So I think
I'm just trying to clear because you know my constituents.
No, I know.
You know what I mean?
They're just going to go to Commander Harad. It's fine.
Exactly. I'll clarify so that way I can be like, look, y'all, this is when it's this person. When it's this person.
I think I would say people should include us and also your MOCR. Here's why. Because MOCRs can help us, while they don't serve a coordinating role, they are your community contact. And what then we will do on our side is work together to determine who is not responsible for all of it, because we're responsible for what we're responsible for, right? Like it's always going to be a little challenging to say there's one person you can go to who oversees all of these things, but we do work together. And some examples, right, like are in your award, right? We have just started working up Georgia Avenue, right? In a couple of locations. In that instance, if residents were to go to Commander Harad, well, he'd kick it back to the captain, and we literally, and I'll just say, have a Teams chat amongst all the agencies doing that work where we communicate. We'll say things like, hey, we saw graffiti, or we saw things dumped. And so it's kind of like a microcosm, but the task forces that we listed are examples of how we're trying to get a little bit more of that coordination and to try and do a little bit more of the no wrong door. But I will admit, like it's very difficult right now to say this is the one place you go. But I do believe MOCRs kind of help air traffic control, and then it's incumbent upon us to work together to figure out who's on first with each of the issues.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
we're a work in progress, Councilwoman.
I know. Well, I'm going to try. Listen, I'm trying to have clear lines so I can help you all in sort of the intake that is coming in. But I think I got it, and I'm going to try to. I will loop in the MOCRs and also just sort of loop you in, Director Holly Harper in, and then we can sort of decide each time. We'll just decide from there how to address the issue sort of collectively, as we've done in the past. As you know, we recently lost a Safe Passage employee at Coolidge High School who was killed by another violence prevention professional. What role does your office play in vetting and training individuals hired for violence prevention and safety roles?
Yeah, so here's the thing, and this is kind of what we're looking at right now, is we have so many different programs that quite frankly have different kind of vetting models, whether it's Credible Messenger, right? Like I was there when we started Credible Messenger, and it was very specific. We worked with DCHR, we established, right, like a way in which they were vetted, and then it passed to PLC. Different programs have different things, and so when it's coming to, I can tell you we were not involved, or DMPSJ was not involved in previously in the vetting of Safe Passage workers, but we are now operational leads, so we will be, right? And so if you think about the current iteration of Safe Passages came into place last year and has grown relatively quickly. I think the first contractors we did the first grant in like December of 2021. I think it was December of 2021. And so it's a work in progress, but we are there are vetting standards, but what we're working on right now is it can't be CBO by CBO. Like there needs to be just an overarching, and probably, and this is again, like why I'm working, quite frankly, why we're working with former Director Lacey. He's ever Director Lacey, to help us to just come up with a framework where, depending on where you are in the continuum, this is what you do. Because part of what's happening, just so you know, is that we work with some really trusted CBOs who may have credible messengers, but Safe Passage workers, VIs, and all of those processes are different, right? Like they're all different because they're established by program. And so our goal is to like we're going through that right now of like, okay, like let's streamline this. Like what are the position description for this and for this position, so that we try and take away some of that ambiguity of, oh wait, VIs, we do this, Safe Passages, we do this, credible messenger is this.
Okay, so you all are sort of in the process, sort of streamlining that process and creating sort of at least a central standard for which we sort of are vetting and training individuals who are hired for violence prevention and safety roles. So that your role is sort of to streamline this whole process as we move forward.
Yes.
Okay. And is there like, do you have what program in your estimation has the best vetting and training protocol? Like what's the plan for replicating the best practices?
Oh, I can't say, it's like choosing between children. We can't do that, but we'll probably pull from each of them. I mean, each of them have their strengths and each of them have different responsibilities. And so the goal will be to try and create some standardization based upon there are differences, whether people know, between a safe passage worker. There is a difference between a VI who is like a street VI worker and someone who's a mediator. Like there's all of these different nuances. And so we're working on ensuring we have appropriate level of clarity for the individuals of role and also the kind of levels of vetting within that.
Okay, perfect. And let me say this: I believe in the Safe Passage program. I believe in the violence intervention program, and I do think we have been making change over the years. And I do feel and see the difference, and I know that doesn't come across with with all things right now. And so want to make sure that the source of my question is, let's find the CBOs who have the best practices. Let's streamline this process and make it better so that when we do get feedback about certain safe passage programs or certain things, we can say, well, this is how this is what we're doing to evaluate, vet, and train these individuals. So that way we keep up with the amazing sort of work, reputation, and efficacy of value there. So I appreciate that you're in the process of streamlining that.
We're in it.
And then other contracts. So what role does your office play in evaluating violence prevention contracts and metrics of success? And sort of what roles does your office play in ensuring sort of responsible spending and contracting, sort of granting of your cluster agencies?
Yeah, I mean, so that's part of the oversight role that we play, right? Like I said, we are all stewards of public trust, and certainly public trust means spending dollars in the way we say we're going to. There are contract administrators and grant administrators for each of those contracts you've described. And so they are the direct entities that are tasked with sort of the everyday kind of grant and contract management. And it's important we maintain and abide by those rules and regulations. But our office has the responsibility to look and to make sure that what we say is happening, right? And so we obviously hear from contractors, from residents and otherwise, and it's our job to work with our agencies to make sure that if there's a gap between what we're hearing and seeing and what we're seeing in the financials, that we're closing those gaps and working together to address them. And so that absolutely is the role of our office when it comes to, it's kind of that same process that I just described of taking a step back, looking at, okay, how is our contracting? We moved from human care agreements for the ones VI contracts, not last fiscal year, but the one before, to grants, right? Okay, how is this working? And there was reasons for that. So we're very much involved in those processes of talking it through with the agencies and then checking and seeing how it's going, because that, again, I talk about accountability for everybody. So
Okay, I appreciate that. This is an area that I appreciate you working on and hoping your team will continue to work on and lead on as we go into the new, as we're in the new fiscal year.
Yeah.
Your office is still the lead liaison for federal ATF purposes. Am I correct?
What do you mean?
So sort of do you all sort of have the details on ATF's engagement sort of in the city and sort of in ward specifically? So if I ask you sort of what are the details on ATF's engagement in Ward 4 and tracing illegal guns associated with Ward 4 crew activities, would you all be the sort of space for that?
That would be more law enforcement, right? So certainly MPD, right, has very regular relationship and conversation with ATF, but so they would be on first when it comes to our federal law enforcement partners in that way.
Okay. Because I agree with you. I know you talked with Chairwoman Pinto about this earlier, but we have to stop we have illegal guns coming into the community, and we have to sort of be very focused on that piece. I want to ask, who is responsible for ensuring all CCTV cameras at DC facilities are working? So rec centers, schools, government office buildings are fully operational and properly capturing and storing data, and sort of who is responsible for supporting when a camera system is down. And I'm asking this because we had a shooting at a DPR center, et cetera, and then we had issues. And I'm assuming you're going to say DGS, and so I'm asking this because I want to understand how your agency works with DGS when there's a flag, like a facility to flag for DGS when something is sort of a public safety concern.
Sure. So on CCTV, they're individual contracts. So there may be that we're writing a contract like MPD, CCTV contracts. I don't believe are the same ones DPR uses, right? Like, so there are differences. And so it really does depend on who the contract is with. And so like the monitoring, for instance, for DPRs, I don't think that's DGS. I believe they have a separate contract, but I couldn't say for sure. But it's not necessarily a universal truth. Another, for instance, I know we had a school that was having issues with some of their cameras and we work with Octo, right? Like, so there is a kind of a host of streams of, depending on what the contract is. But if you're asking how we work with DGS on issues, so just like every agency, right? Like at the agency level, there will be like almost daily, right? Like that interactions with DGS. But the role that our office plays is we will have regular meetings about the clusters with the internal services cluster, right? So internal services, I would say, is more of our counterpart, led under the direction of the Assistant City Administrator. Internal services consist of Octo, DCHR, OCP, and DGS. So we meet regularly to say, here's some of the issues, the hard to, kind of the challenging issues and how can we get resolution. And they're really in it with us, right? Like DOC, we had issues with the boilers. We engaged IIS and we're really able to get a resolution relatively quickly as compared to maybe sometimes at the agency level back and forth. So it's that kind of elevated and more systemic engagement where it's like, here's a list of the issues that are public safety and justice-based issues. Let's talk through our agencies.
Okay.
And it helps them to prioritize because obviously like the individual issues, there's a lot of them. So being able to sit down as a cluster to cluster, helps them to have visibility into sort of a larger picture of what's going on and to manage their agencies in that way then.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Pinto.
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis George. Thank you for being with us today. Okay, there was a lot of good stuff there. So I'm trying to think about our best use of time here because some of those I have follow-up questions on. But I want to get your understanding of kind of the life cycle in practice when it comes to our youth. Because this is an issue we hear a lot of with concerns about public safety. And can you explain the distinction between who's making the charging decision when a child is going through our DYRS programming, when they're going through CSOSA, if there are gaps in that decision-making process that need to be addressed to ensure that our young people are getting the services they need and being held accountable when crimes are committed?
Sure. So the juvenile space is one that's mysterious to people, but like was my home base for 9 years. And so initial arrest, right? Like if a young person commits a crime, MPD arrests, charging decisions are made by the Office of the Attorney General, which has a jurisdiction over juveniles and over juvenile crime in the city. So versus adults where the U.S. Attorney's Office, right, like makes charging decisions. So at the initial, just like kind of the MPD and OAG will have conversation right at arrest. Is this a youth that we need to bring into the youth service center to be processed by court social services? Court social services is probation for youth and it's under the court, DC Superior Court. So oversight for juvenile probation is by the court in court social services, so not the executive. So I've now named kind of MPD, then OAG, then there'll be, right, like some interaction with CSSD. A court, the young person will then go to court after a charge if there's been a decision, hey, we're not gonna hold them overnight securely. They'll go to court. And the judge will then make a decision, hey, does this youth need to be held at the facilities run by the district? So the juvenile detention facility in the district is Youth Services Center on Mount Olivet Road. That decision at the initial decisions made by the court, and the court can release a young person home. The court can say, hey, this youth needs a little more supervision, and they'll go to a shelter home, which is again, contracted by the district, or they'll be held securely pending their matter, and that's at the Youth Services Center run by the executive. The youth process then goes forward. We are not, the executive, if they're with us, then, we have them at Youth Service Center. Otherwise, we're not really involved in that process. And so the adjudicatory process, or that determining what's going to happen with the youth, is the prosecutors at OAG, the defense counsel, and then the court. If a youth finds their way to commitment, right, which is the deep end of the juvenile justice system, that's when the executive becomes involved again, because we run commitment through the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, and then they'll be committed for a certain period of time, at which point D.F.S then makes all decisions about what sort of services, supports, level of supervision, level of placement is needed. So we always say that the executive runs the front door of the Youth Services Center, and then basically the back door at D.F.S. And in the middle, we're not actually legally, we don't have any legal authority over that young person in that process. So does that make sense?
Okay. It does. I'm going to ask you two follow-ups here so you can kind of address both of them in the way that makes most sense. So because today we're having an oversight hearing also of the Attorney General's, very timely. Within that middle process, as you look at the challenges that we're facing with young people involved in criminal activity, and as you and the chief have talked about, in many instances, the first arrest being one that involves a gun. What kind of gaps do you see are in that middle process of supports or intervention or accountability? And then second, it's my understanding, and correct me if this is wrong, but if the U.S. attorney determines to charge that young person as an adult, that they then go through the CSOSA process, which limits the district's ability to use our rehabilitative services and supports. And so how do we, if that's accurate, how do we rectify that challenge of our inability to reach them?
Okay, so let me take the Title 16 first. So the U.S. Attorney's Office makes a decision on Title 16. Those are the 16 and 17-year-olds who are charged as adults. So now they're in DC Superior Court. If they're determined to be held securely, they go to DYRS, because no one under 18 can be at DC jail. So at that point, they will be in a DYRS facility pending their whole legal process, right, until sentencing, at which point, if they're found guilty, they go to the marshals and BOP. But we will provide any youth in DYRS's care and custody at our facility. We're going to provide whatever services and supports we can within the facility. So education, there wouldn't be a distinction of what's provided there. If a young person's released, which happens, you're right. They will actually be under the supervision of PSA, Pretrial Service Agency. So all of their conditions are going to be set by PSA, and there's not going to be a service delivery, not really, right? Like there's not like, oh, you know what? Like while they're pending adjudication, we're going to provide a host of services, because they have no real legal connection to the district. That's all federal, right? Pretrial services is federal. U.S. Attorney's Office is federal. So there's no district connectivity. That's a Title 16 youth, which is a problem, right? Because if they're going away to the, no matter what, if a young person's in the community and they've committed offenses, we believe they're at risk and they need services and supports. And there's no necessary touch point to do that. I think there's a similar thing that happens on juvenile side, that just like across our system, there is we favor release. We want young people in the least restrictive means consistent with public safety. A young person who is not committed, doesn't find their way, they will likely be under the supervision of court social services, whatever's determined between OAG, the court social services. And I think CSSD will say that they're not the executive. So they don't have this whole robust, they're under the court, this whole robust set of interventions, the things that we know help a young person to find their way to a better path. They don't have that. And sometimes in order to get a young person to participate in their family, you need commitment or a hook or something that says, hey, you have to do this because this is what's best for you. And without that, it makes it challenging. So in the executive, we can offer, say, hey, listen, like we're concerned about these young people and public safety. They've committed or they've been involved in or around gun crime or something that's, we're thinking there's an issue here. But there's nothing that will make them accept services. There's nothing that makes them be in treatment. There's no requirement. And that's a challenge because teenagers don't always want to do what we believe needs to be done or is best for them or otherwise. And so that's where the gap is, hey, MPD is like, listen, we arrested this young person for something. They may be released. They may never get committed. What happens? And especially if they don't get committed, how are we making sure that they are getting the types of wraparound services that we know prevent additional criminal justice system involvement?
Right.
It's hard for us to do that without some means to do it.
So I want to ask you about something you just said about we favor release. What does that mean? Who is we? Is that codified somewhere? And one of the things that I was most concerned about in my conversations with your predecessor, Deputy Mayor Geldart, about was this very troubling data that we had last year that many of the people who are being arrested for gun-related offenses ultimately become victims of gun-related crime. And without removing them from those situations or providing services that are needed actively, we are just allowing our residents to be killed. And I'm curious how you think about the intersection of that troubling data and where we are this year with that and what you just described as we favor release.
So let me clarify, because I often use we as with the district, but the executive obviously doesn't make, by and large, the executive doesn't make decisions on detention. There's one instance in which we do, and I'll talk about in a minute. I think there has been, seeming to me through the law and listening to our partners in CJCC, a belief that our statutory scheme, I think honestly, council's posture was one that supported this previously, that release was favored. I mean, I've certainly heard the court say that. I've heard that there was discussion of a change in 2019 that favored release, right? So there is a preference.
And when you talk about the statutory posture, what statute are you referring to?
That I can't. I see Councilmember Lewis George on the prosecutorial side, this is,
Okay, maybe
I can talk more about, I can speak specifically to the one thing under the executive's umbrella, which is determination of level of placement once a young person's with DYRS. But I saw her camera go on, so.
I'm just going to say it's statute 16-23T10, which is the criteria for detaining children. And that is the statute for which the court determines whether a child is held or released. And that is where you're going to find I wouldn't characterize it as release, I will say. That's the statute where you'll find.
Okay, and if I may ask you a follow-up question, Councilmember George, thank you so much for your expertise here. Is it your understanding that that statute provides discretion for the judges, or that statute requires release?
Well, it's going to. It is a hard burden to overcome for a judge to hold a child. So basically, a child cannot be held prior to a hearing or a dispositional hearing, a trial, fact-finding hearing or dispositional hearing, unless they're alleged to be delinquent and unless it appears available information that the detention is required, to protect the person or property of others from significant harm, or two, to secure the child's presence at the next court hearing. So the judge has to say, is this child a flight risk to secure child's next present at court hearing? Or is there a person or property to a person or property that is under significant harm if this child would be released. And sort of there's a rebuttable presumption for certain types of crime, which is like crimes with a weapon, CPWL, carrying a pistol without a license, where there's a rebuttable presumption. We have to prove that that's the case. But that statute, when it was changed, essentially is a high burden for a judge to basically hold a juvenile based on that. The biggest key is that one piece of this was removed, I don't know what year it was, which was to protect the child from personal harm.
It was 2017 under the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment.
There you go.
They removed that aspect as well. I don't know about the adult side. I've heard that. I mean, I think there might be some mirroring, but on the juvenile side, under the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act, that is when that change was made. And that was, I believe it was the CYJA of 2017. So it might have gone into effect FY18, but yeah.
Got it. Okay. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Councilor Lewis George. So to the adult side, and I heard you just say, I don't know if it mirrors it exactly, but is your understanding, I would imagine that the burden is less to hold somebody for an adult than it is for a child?
I mean, potentially, I don't know, so this is again, where it's like a prosecutorial and the judges, and you hear what they say, that the burden is relatively high on either side, that because there is a posture, or there was in the district, that favored release. I mean, wherever that's right, I think but
I guess the reason I'm asking about this is because as the deputy mayor, I view one of the missions of your job is to identify where these gaps are. We hear along the continuum constantly. Yep. Okay, well, we didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest, or we made an arrest, but then we couldn't get the case closed, or we got the case closed, but the case wasn't papered, or it was papered, but the person was released. And there is a constant pointing at various different agencies of where the gaps are. And my hope is that you and I can work together as partners to figure out where those gaps are and help plug them. Yeah. And so I don't mean to ask you so much minutia about the statute, and I'm so glad we have our resident expert here to help us, and that was very useful. But I more mean, it's easy to identify the problems. Yeah. But we have to look forward now and figure out how to solve them. And so that's what I'm trying to get at, is as you look at the continuum of the gaps as it relates to the court system, and I'll just, if you can answer this, and then we can move back to you, Councilor Lewis George, where you talked about Title 16 and some of the prosecutorial discretion, how can we solve some of those gaps in a way that you think, with your experience, would help improve public safety?
So, I mean, I think this is the work of CJCC that I'd like to see us move towards, right? That the executive, there was a discussion a few years ago where the mayor, and I don't think people like this, but I think it's a fair one, said we have to hold every part of the system accountable, right? And so we use that word and people don't know what it means, but this discussion alone is one that would be eye-opening to people, because our residents don't understand our system. And oftentimes what's happening is, I use an example of, and people see MPD in community. They are the people they see more often than anything else. That's a fact. So when we have community members assist MPD in arrest, right? Someone's committed a gun crime, they're like, listen, I'm telling you this happened. MPD arrests them. They then see that person back in community, right? The next day, because there was a decision made at papering, right? To not hold them, which is not a Metropolitan Police Department decision. Papering is a decision that's made by the prosecutors. Holding is a decision made by the court. Well, what community says is, you all look at, you brought them right back to our community, and MPD's we actually don't make that decision, right? We arrested, and it's eroding the trust of the public in police and into the executive and all of us, right? So I think it's a fair discussion to have that, hey, where was I have heard amongst our partners, it said that there is a preference in the district. The pendulum swings. I'm a very sort of honest person, that the pendulum swings in our space about what is preferred. And there was a move that that the district was very progressive around these types of policies, legislatively and otherwise, right? That's a fact that we have to sort of contend with. So whether there are legislative moves that were made, like the one I described, I think many of them were well-meaning. I'll give another example. Under the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act, this is on juvenile side, young people, status offenders can't be held securely. And I understand why. There's a belief they should be in the neglect system. But our young people involved in sex trafficking and sex work are some of the most challenging young people to serve. They run back to the trauma and the places they were being victimized. There is study after study in specialized juvenile courts on this, that you have to hold that group, because to get them the services that you need, you got to hold them. So even at the time, I believe it was both D.Y.R.S. and then Attorney General Racine's office testified, listen, we understand philosophically why this should be a direction we move, but we are testifying that we believe this portion of the bill should not go forward, because these young people right now, we have to serve them, and we believe they'll be harmed. It proceeded and it became law. And in fact, I'm not finger pointing, I'm telling you just from a practical perspective, what we expected happened. Those young people were finding in trap houses with their pimps, and there's not any mechanism we have to really do much, which is why our CSHA court, which was our child use sexual exploitation court that we started based model in Philadelphia, they're like, without the ability to hold, we've lost one of the key components. And I think this is a truism across the district, is that we bring wonderful models or we establish them, but we pull pieces off and we're like, why aren't we getting the effectiveness? Well, because philosophically, we're like, well, we like this piece, not that piece, not. So we do have to have a holistic conversation that there's legislative, there's prosecutorial, and there is executive decisions made that impact where we are right now. And that's absolutely true in the juvenile space.
I appreciate that, and I get that. I guess I'll just say, with our new roles in this committee, and when there is a legislative gap, I invite you to make our committee aware of it so we can kind of move in the right direction. But thank you. And Councilor Lewis George, go ahead, you have another 15-minute round.
Yeah. And I just want to note, the one piece I want to say is that holding decisions is the discretion of judges and the judiciary. And there is no sort of accountability of the judiciary anywhere. It's not just DC, it's nationally. Once a judge is appointed to the bench, they're appointed to the bench. It takes very much for a judge sort of be removed. And judicial discretion is sort of this thing that's held very highly and as it should be. But let me say that I think judicial discretion should be held very highly and made separate. But I think that is I agree that there's this sort of confusion whether someone is held or released. It is absolutely the decision of a judge and the judicial system. And I agree, people don't have clarity around who makes that determination. And that's a huge issue. I mean, they're like, y'all released them. Y'all put them back on the street. Like, the judge released them, by the way, but that's neither here nor there. I want to talk to you about when we do have people in the system. Advocates who recently share with my office that the educational programming at DC jail has been significantly cut. What is going on here? Why are educational programming at DC jail, and not in just DC jail, but also our youth rehabilitation centers, why are educational programs being cut?
I don't know what they're referring to at both. So currently at all of the secure facilities, whether it's the D.Y.R.S. or at a DOC, the See Forever Foundation, the Maya Angelou schools are the educational providers for all of those facilities. So that's right. And part of the decision in that was Maya Angelou School was like an award-winning school at New Beginnings, right? Like, they have been a wonderful partner. And so DCP, there was a decision a couple of years ago, maybe last year, to remove DCPS, and Maya has been the contracted provider now across all the facilities. So I don't know that there were cut like DCPS was removed, but Maya Angelou was brought in. And in fact, the current Maya contract for the DC jail is with Aussie. but we'll be moving over to DOC in the next fiscal year. So there's no funding cut or anything like that that's related to education. Like I said, DCPS is no longer the provider, but Maya Angelou School, we've had a long and positive relationship with providing, high quality education to our secure populations. And so.
Okay, well, if you could just take a look, because what I'm hearing from both from DC jail and from our youth rehabilitation is that the education services sort of rehabilitation part of being, because incarceration is supposed to be about rehabilitation. And so if they're not getting educational services or supports while at DC jail or in youth rehabilitation services, I think it's an issue. So if you could just check in and see what our service providers are doing there, sure. I think it could go a long way. I want to understand, there have been people have had issues with the differing between grants we're doing and the human care agreements. What's the difference between the grants and human care agreements?
Yeah, so human care agreements are administered through the Office of Contracts and Procurement, right? And so they're versus grants, which are administered by agencies that have grant making authority. And so with the ones VI contracts, they were on OCP human care agreements, which it's not. I mean, quite frankly, that's a challenging kind of model for the VI contracts for what they do. Also for the providers, even working with OCP, because OCP contracts are specific and kind of regimented, to be honest with you, in the way in which they operate. And so the flexibility of even what the ask is oftentimes, we really believe this is why grants exist. There was a model that we had with ones that we had seen in other spaces, whether OVSJG, which is where we first had the grants, right, who are very used to working with these providers specifically and other providers like them in the justice grants and the victim services, but really the justice grant space. There was a decision to put those there first. One has grant making authority, but we also believe you have to have the proper infrastructure. We then moved them to PLC, Progressive Life Center, because Progressive Life Center is the administrative partner for DYRS and has long had a relationship with DYRS, with the district, right, in administering very similar types of grants. And they are now the administrative partner for administering the ones grants. And so there was the distinction of understanding how to work with these providers, to be honest with you, and the flexibility in the structure of how you can structure a grant agreement versus a human care agreement, which we do for things like hospitals and food. And, they're relatively fixed and they're through the Office of Contracts Procurement. So that was the distinction there. And that was, like I said, made last fiscal, I believe it was fiscal year 22. Yeah. And so the distinctions, I always say things are a work in progress, and we have some work to do in making sure that the grant agreements, right, are very clear. And because there was a switch made last year, I think we have some work to do in defining the programmatic relationship. The administrative side, I don't think there's challenges because, like I said, PLC is very used to administering these types of grants. It's just there was a very different relationship between ones and the providers under the human care agreements, in which, the ones wasn't even the contract administrator, it was OCP, right? But it's important for the models that ones be very involved with the CBOs who had a lot of autonomy, in deciding what they were doing. And so we want to make more standardization. And so that's what's happening in that space. And I think, as our office is involved, as we meet with Director Harley Harper, we didn't, there's been a while since we had a director at once, right? A permanent director. We thank Director Hunter for serving interim, but an interim is not going to make huge changes in structure. And that was a big change. So we're working on making sure the agreements are really clear and that then PLC is able to administer in the way they do all the other grants that they're very used to administering in this space.
Okay. Well, as you look to figure out best practices there, I'm asking you to look in and try to figure out best practices that are, that'll be consistent across the board and yield good results in as far as providers go, that you'll result in our community that we can be able to report back.
Yeah.
Another agency under your cluster, which we've had issues with in the past, regarding D.F.S.
Yep.
As you know, and speaking of sort of history of things, the accreditation issue really was a huge hit to the district, and a number of cases were appealed successfully. A number of releases occurred as a result of those successful appeals. And sort of, I think that's something that sort of also gets sort of lost in conversation. And so I just want to understand sort of what your role is in ensuring we don't have any further accreditation issues, and sort of what steps are being taken on your end to sort of correct, I guess, the issues of the past.
Sure. And so, like, this is a space in which our office is very involved, right? Like, ensuring the foundational, like, structural soundness of PSJ agencies is a priority. With D.F.S, you know, there's kind of two levels in which our office is involved. One is that we are the deputy mayors overseeing D.F.S. And so, like every other agency, it's our job to support them in having good plans. And in this case, the reaccreditation process is one that requires a lot of different moving parts, from staffing to contracting to relationship management, to all of those things working together to get them to the point that the lab is ready to be reaccredited. We provide, I like to think, a lot of like the backbone to a lot of those things of helping the structural, every lane, whether it's the relational lane with federal and the multiple stakeholders, to the actual functional of like, hey, our lab isn't functioning. Do we have contracts in place to make sure that these services are still being provided? To the actual, what is the, like, here's like the checklist. How are we doing on the checklist of where we need to get to the point of reaccreditation? So that's, you know, kind of the one piece. And then we are also the chair, and this is a tricky thing, right, of the stakeholder council. But the challenge across the district, which will always be the case, is we are unique because we have such a strong local federal. And our interests can be the same, but they also sometimes aren't. And so the way in which we work together can be extremely challenging, and also very difficult for agencies that are trying to, you know, they're in the process of rebuilding while also managing a lot of very challenging and tricky relationships. So, you know, our job is to step in and assist with some of that, because I was general counsel at D.F.S for much of my time when we were trying to work our way through the Jerry M litigation. And I think structural change is structural change. For an agency that's trying to operate and do all these things, it can be extremely, honestly, distracting and very difficult to have all of these various things going on, including, you know, a significant structural change. And so I do believe it's our job to help them continue to move forward, because we need a functioning lab, and we need functioning lab services, and we need good relationships, and we need all of it. And so, particularly for an agency in such heavy transition, it's our responsibility to make sure each of those lanes are moving in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I agree with you. In order for us to successfully bring any sort of cases, if D.F.S is unaccredited, it means that all of our cases are impacted, because it's a required part of evidence that has to be not only introduced, but authenticated. And if they can't be authenticated, then the cases are going to get dismissed, or charges are not going to be able to be brought. Which brings me to our other point. I know the U.S. Attorney's Office is federal jurisdiction, and so I know neither the executive nor the legislative branch of government sort of has purview over them. But one area in particular that, Deputy Mayor, I'm hoping you can sort of be able to get information on is, a lot of times we hear that a case is not papered, but we don't have the reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
And because we don't have the reasoning, I can't sort of surmise whether is the case not paper because MPD didn't collect enough evidence? Is the case not paper because it was sort of an unlawful constitutionally? Or sort of without the reasons, we can't improve any of the pieces, right, of our end, right? Because if it is, we don't have witnesses to a case, or we don't have evidence, or if it's an area where MPD needs to train officers better on sort of constitutional things, none of these improvements can be made without us sort of us knowing the reasons why a case is in paper. Or is it philosophical? Because we need to know that too, right? But oftentimes I have reached out personally and sent emails and saying to U.S. Attorney's Office, hey, this case was no paper. I would like to know the reasoning. And we don't get a response, and they don't have to respond to us. But I'm hoping as Deputy Mayor, you could at least request some data regarding the reasons why cases are not paper, meaning like, was it paper for lack of evidence, lack of witnesses, unconstitutionality, whatever it is, sort of court expended, like, you know, we have a backup of cases, and this case is considered de minimis as form of harm. My goal is for you to sort of put on that hat and try to at least get some information that can assist the district in dealing with crime in our community.
Sure. I mean, I think a big part of the responsibility of my office and myself specifically is we keep using the word accountability, but it is like the transparency to our residents. We all work and serve our residents, right? And so no matter what space you're in, like I think it's incumbent upon all of us to figure out ways to be as transparent with them as we can. And so, you know, I'm happy to take on, we have a working relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office, obviously, and appreciate the partnership when we can be partners with our federal partners, also recognizing that, you know, we're not always going to be on the same page. I will say this, that we all come together in the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. And I think one of the strongest aspects of that body is data gathering. And one of the things that I likely will push, and we will push, is the ability to share more of that publicly. Because as you likely know, right now, there's this whole body of information that everyone's like, no, we can't share publicly. And I do think there's a benefit to our residents understanding, and if we have it, like looking for, quite frankly, a legislative fix or otherwise, to say, we need to share with our residents, right? Because we're all working on behalf of, for, and with our residents. And so, why can't we share information? I don't care. I mean, I'll be honest, whether you're local or federal, we all are public servants. And so helping our residents understand, or the constituents we serve, seems to be in all of our interest. And so I do think where Chairwoman Pinto asked where there's legislative fixes, that is a place, right? Like the way in which CJCC data can be shared is, there's an MOU, but there's also the legislative, there's statutory things around what can be shared. And I do think there's some space for us to grow in that space, right? In what we can share publicly, because there's a lot of information we have, not all of it, and that's the relationship piece. But if we do have it, can we share more?
Yeah, and so next time I'm going to be talking to OAG, because I do want to understand some data points before we, make any legislative changes. I do think there's a lot of data that we need to understand so that we can make that an informed decision. So thank you, and I look forward to working with you. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Liz George. Ward 5 Councilmember Zachary Parker is joining us, so I will give him a 15-minute round. I do just want to ask one follow-up question about our court conversation, Deputy Mayor, and then next round we can move on to another topic, which is the gaps in time between the charging decision and the hearing or trial date. And if there are trends that you have seen over the last several years that we are working to ameliorate, so that this challenge of making sure that we have sufficient evidence to bring a case and conclude that case between when the arrest is made.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the pandemic upended. We have a very, very busy court in the District of Columbia, right? We do. We have a lot of cases. And we also don't have the ability to fill our own judicial vacancies. So we have a court that needs to be staffed at a certain level to really, I think, move the volume of cases we have. And we never actually are fully staffed. I don't think in my 11 years that I've been here has our court's been fully staffed. You know, we run as many as 14 vacancies like we had recently to now where we have 8, but we know there's judges retiring, right? Like the court is always letting us know that the challenge of not being able to appoint your own judges or how, you know, have an executive who can appoint judges or otherwise like other states do, puts us at the mercy of the federal government when they kind of get around to it. And so our case processing is always going to be at the whim of that. The pandemic obviously created a situation in which case processing, you know, ground much slower, right? And that means that we accumulated a backlog, particularly in those priority 1, like some of the more serious felony cases, that has slowed things down. And that I know that the court is working very hard to catch up and to move those cases down the ball down the field. But anytime you have a backlog anywhere, any agency or otherwise, there's always new things coming in, right? Like, and so it is very challenging to catch up. And so I would say that yes, right, like case processing, like I said, has slowed for a host of reasons, and that there is kind of a longer period of time, particularly in the more serious felony cases of pretrial period. But we definitely have made progress from like the height of the pandemic when we couldn't see juries, you know, we couldn't see grand juries and then when we did, it was a much diminished number. And so the court is certainly making progress. It just, you know, these are the realities that that are somewhat unique to the district.
Thank you. So we have been joined by our Ward 5 colleague, Zachary Parker. Council member, you will have a 15-minute round. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairwoman Pinto. And it is good to see you, Deputy Mayor. I want to start at a macro, let's say 30,000 view. And I know our conversation has been far ranging, but if you had to characterize steps that we need to take in the immediate term to make the district safer, what would you encourage the council to consider?
Oh, I mean, so this isn't necessarily, I think we've talked about kind of the role everybody plays in this, whether it's legislation. I'll be very frank. At the end of last fiscal year, or end of last year, there was a flurry of legislation that was passed that changes even fundamental structure of agencies. Right. So as we're trying to on our side, focus our efforts, worked very hard to get permanent, you know, directors in place or otherwise to make sure that our foundation is secure and that we're moving forward on all of these plans when there's now like sort of rapid shifts in responsibility structure or otherwise, those are challenges. And so I try to be practical that those are things to consider, that when we have plans in place, there's always room for agency growth and development, but we are making like pretty significant changes in agency function through legislation for likely good reasons. But you know, that obviously shifts focus sometimes for the agencies that are trying to focus on core missions when whole new responsibilities or, you know, for D.F.S. made an independent agency, right? Like not under the purview of the executive. This creates a host of new considerations. So that's one side, I think at a macro level is as we're on a legislative side, I put to you because you asked what council should consider, right? Like, where are we in our system, right? Because I think we are at the forefront of everything in the district. We really do push the ball down the field of reform in so many areas. But I'm a very sort of practical person that we are coming out of a pandemic, right? That impacted us as well. Like our government and our agencies, my agencies, they're people. And many of them worked through the pandemic. They never stayed home, right? Like they faced very, very challenging conditions. We have diminished staffing, right? We have some lags and systemic changes that happened throughout the pandemic that we have to figure out how to address. And so before we do the new, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to look at, I keep using the slingshot analogy, in order for us to come back, like maybe a bit of a step back in our pace of acceleration. And instead, how are we doing foundationally and recognizing that, you know, I have work to do as the deputy mayor to look at my agencies and to figure out how to best support the people who have really put in work over time, who are tired, who are working a lot of hours, to make sure that despite that, we're working together, we're working coordinated across cluster, that we're thinking in new ways how to multiply our efforts to achieve what we have to, which is to make our city safer and to make sure our residents feel safer as well.
Thank you for that. And I want to come back to that. And now I'm going to zero in very specific areas. So I know you and Councilwoman Lewis George had a conversation about the DC jail. I've heard similar reports around reduce programs and opportunities for inmates, especially young people, and especially inmates that may need special education services. I am aware of the efforts to make the DC jail a LEA, and it seems as though work is in process there. The concern, though, is that in doing so, there is less oversight, if you will, and to ensure that young people that are incarcerated are receiving high quality in-person learning and instruction. And you know that was a concern for all children at the height of the pandemic, which is one of the reasons why the mayor pushed for students to return to school, which I think was ultimately the right choice. Yeah. You speak to just where we are in that process and transition, and can you speak to the concerns that DC jail becoming its own LEA will reduce oversight and the quality of education offerings to these inmates?
Sure. So the on the LEA front, right? Like we are having conversations in the executive. What is the best structure? Whether it's DOC being an LEA or just as D.F.S is a public agency responsible for education. At the end of the day, OSSI is the state educational agency and will provide oversight no matter what the actual structure is. And in fact, you know, how we did it at D.F.S was we had an MOA to make sure that monitoring was happening. And we're as committed to that, right, on the DOC side as we were on the D.F.S side. And so I myself am involved in those conversations with the Deputy Mayor for Education, with students in the custody of DC, with the superintendent herself, to make sure that the structure that we come up ensures that young people, no matter where they are in our system, but certainly right now we're talking about DOC, have the education that they are entitled to, right? And so not looking to change Maya, to be honest with you, because they really have proven over time.
So that was going to be my question. Is there, sorry to interrupt, but is there an opportunity for Maya Angelou to continue?
Oh, yes. That's our plan. The plan is no matter who, the plan is for Maya to continue to be our educational provider at the DOC. That is, we are putting, well, there should be a contract put on the street. We've been working with OCP to make sure that, like I said, DOC will pick that actual contract up in the fall. There will be no break. Maya is
good to hear.
Is our partner for education at the DOC.
Because as you alluded, I've also heard that by all accounts, many people think they're doing a good job and they're providing that high quality in-person instruction. And so can you also provide assurance that there isn't an effort to make this virtual, that it will remain in-person instructional support for these inmates?
Oh yes, there's no, like, we're not, right, like we believe in in-person instruction, so there's no shift to, I mean, we really appreciate that what the tablet learning and all of that like allows us to do with some of our alternative types of educational, whether it's college courses or otherwise, but Maya Angelou is the school, or the See Forever Foundation, the Maya Angelou School, is the school, and the model is not one that we're looking to change.
Okay.
I do want to address, you asked about programming.
Yes.
And so, you know, what I just spoke about a little bit ago is a reality that, you know, DOC has a number of critical vacancies, right? That these are hard to fill positions, and that one of the key parts of any secure facility is that you have to have enough frontline staff to create a safe environment so that we're able to do all that we want to do, right? Like there's been no shift in our belief about the importance of programming and rehabilitative programming in any of our secure facilities. But we also are contending with the reality of that, DOC has a lot of vacancies, and that as a result, and I will just say this, that contraband and these issues that kind of cut against movement are realities that we have to contend with, and that we are working, just like we talked about with MPD or any of our agencies that have hard to fill vacancies, to figure out what are the ways that we can attract and retain these critical positions so that we can do all the things we want to do. We have to, like, I am committed that there are the things we have to do. We have to have people safe in our facilities. It's important, right? This is vital. We want them safe no matter whether they're in the DWARS facilities or the DOCs. And so we need to get that staffing in place so that we then can do all this programming that we believe is extremely important as well.
So it sounds like you're attributing the reduction in programming to staffing, which is something we're addressing across the district. From advocates' point of view, whether this is fair or not, it seems as though they're attributing this to new leadership over the DC jail and an effort to reduce programming. So for instance, the
YME.
Yeah, the YME program is one of the more lauded efforts.
Yep.
What's concerning about that for me, as you alluded to, is that we need to focus on rehabilitating these individuals, these young men in particular that are in DC jail before releasing them. And so I would love to follow up with you on that.
Yeah, there's no philosophical shift. There's a couple of things that happened. There's the staffing piece, and then also Dr. Lopez, who we loved, she did leave, right? So transition always, there's a period where it's like, okay, you have people kind of filling the holes of the people who departed, and she is, she was a force. We have recently hired a deputy director who's known to DWARS, to DOC, but I don't think they've said who yet, so I won't say, but to fill that position, which is such a critical one. But as you know, right, you have to have leadership. You have to have leadership in this space. Otherwise, there are people trying to maintain what is. And so having stable leadership will help us to ensure that we're able to continue all the programming that we really believe is important. It's not a philosophical shift, it's shifts.
Gotcha. So with that, I just hope that we can then have a concerted effort to beef up staffing there.
Oh, yeah.
So we can focus on those programs for the young people that need it most. I see my time is dwindling. I want to move on to coordination. And this has been a lot of the discussion that you've been having, both with the U.S. Attorney's Office, but I want to focus here within the district. So one of the concerns I have is that we have a plethora of public safety agencies, teams, offices. It is my understanding that you all are meeting, that there is a coordination effort, but can you speak to the transition from what once was Building Blocks DC that is now, my guess is the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement / the Gun Violence Prevention Office. And what does that mean for coordinated efforts on the ground? And so I'm sure Councilmember Lewis George would agree, as I would and my colleagues in Ward 7 and 8, and it's an issue across the city, but it's pronounced in those areas of the city that we need coordinated support and efforts on the ground. And respectfully, I'm just not always clear what that coordination is looking like or what it's producing. So can you just speak to that transition and then what we should be seeing on the ground?
Yeah, and so the transition in the Building Blocks Initiative is not a change in philosophy, right? We still believe that how you get the greatest impact in gun violence is by a coordinated, focused, intensive effort on the people and the places most at risk. That's what undergirded, that's the philosophy that undergirded it. But we also, in trying, right, it was the first of its kind, EOC, right, found that model, while good, it takes a lot to set up administratively, right, this new model, where we have agencies where this work needs to actually be institutionalized in, right? Because you're talking about long-term work. This is not going to just end, right? Usually with an EOC, there's an emergency activation, and then whatever the inciting incident is, at some point ends, correct? Right? Like, it's not like, oh, we had an EOC forever. It's like, we had a snowstorm, we had a pandemic, we have these, we have a major event. Unfortunately, gun violence is something that's with us, right? And so creating structures that over the long term are able to address this is important. And so that's what we learned is we have, the Office of Gun Violence Prevention was established to set up, like with all of the things that you've described, an overarching policy perspective on what are we doing and how are we doing. And then on the other side, you had PSJ, which has the operational agencies. Place-based work was assumed by my office, right? And our community outreach coordinator and a team of folks doing outreach in certain neighborhoods. We particularly focused on the Homicide Reduction Partnership Initiative areas because that's where our focus was last year. And then you had ones being operational. Well, part of what we saw is no matter what in the government, if you have different leadership, you often will, there's the push and pull, which is why Linda Harley Harper was named by the mayor to be the director over ones in OGVP because it brings together in a single place policy and operations. So there's none of there will be less of, our hope is less of that tension, and also the support of DMPSJ, because one's is a DMPSJ agency, so you don't have kind of out here this other arm, if that makes sense.
Sorry to interrupt, but I see I only have 1 more minute. So there was a shooting in Ward 5 in the Saratoga community last night.
Yeah.
What I'm getting at is, what should I be seeing on the ground? Because there are violence interrupters in that area. Obviously, MPD is following up.
Yep.
There just seems to be a lack of a coordinated citywide approach, which is what was the promise of building blocks, which is what is the promise of many of these agencies. And if you could just, in the last 30 seconds I have, speak to what should we be seeing on the ground in response to that shooting in Saratoga last night?
Okay, so what would happen today is there was a call at 8:30 with MPD who outlines for our violence interruption space. So one's, it used to be OGVP in our office, right? But now it's like one's OGVP, kind of same thing, explaining what happened. There's then a coordination meeting with the VIs, right? Where now one's is like, we know, we understand what happens. Now, who are our VIs in Ward 5? Whether CURE, right? Because we're now working together with CURE at an operational level, the administrative or whatever, who knows, right? We have to work on that. But operationally to say, does anyone know any of these people? Is anybody involved? Who's touching that neighborhood? It's like a critical incident response type deal. And sometimes we don't know. Then to formulate a plan of, okay, are there people who need to be spoken to, right? Like, do we need to, do we need MPD resources? What are the resources we need to mediate any dispute that this might be arising out of? And it really is that very granular of like, they had a call at 8:30, they'll have a call at 2 o'clock. They'll come up with a plan with the actual CBO and VIs in Ward 5, and then it's the go to work piece. And so what you see sometimes is hard to know, like to say, because each incident is different. Some are not crew based, some are, long-term disputes where people have been trying to mediate, and so you don't really see that work, but it's happening. I don't know if that makes.
I have more, but that is my time. I want to be respectful. Thank you, Chairwoman Pinto.
Thank you, Councilmember Parker, for being here. So Deputy Mayor, let's keep talking about our violence interruption programs. And as you have come into this role, as you look at the evolution of where these programs started and what they've kind of turned into, it seems like we had building blocks in 2021, which sort of morphed into People of Promise. And now with the leadership of Director Harley Harper, we're combining, it seems a little bit, the Office of Gun Violence Prevention and building blocks with ones. And so can you talk about kind of how and why those decisions were made and why that gives you confidence to have them housed in one central location, if that's what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, so there's like 2021 wasn't the start of sort of our work in this space, right? Like we've long had community-based organizations doing prevention and violence prevention and violence intervention work. Beginning in 2015, and I believe the Safer Stronger plan actually came out in 2016, we had this plan that was like that as a result of the NEAR Act, right, like establish this office, ONES, to be the sort of focus, foci, if you will, of violence prevention and intervention efforts. And that was what sort of the idea was, right, is this office will be our prevention side of the house that will help us to operationalize this very well thought out and deeply, from community, government, and otherwise plan to help us operationalize that, which was the genesis of our VI program. At the same time, even D.F.S was establishing transformative mentoring Incredible Messenger that was specific in how it did violence prevention. But that I know because I was there was communication between ONES and D.F.S at the director level and at the operational level. Many people at ONES were previously at D.F.S on, what's the model? How are we going to do this and otherwise? That evolved. It didn't change. The work was being done to, there's this intensive thing going on though, like this spike in gun violence, right? That is an emergency. How do we focus all of our efforts in an emergency type of way on this? Which was the thinking illuminate. It didn't change the theory, the model, or otherwise that undergirded ONES. In many respects, ONES was supposed to kind of fold in and the other agencies to be under this coordinating body to help really just bring everything together. None of that has changed. It just is having this external body that was the EOC, right? The Emergency Operations Center. It was, I think in theory, like it works for an emergency, but again, where you're like, well, this is where the programs all are. They're all around here, right? Like you can't bring everybody into one space in the same way as you would in a snowstorm. I don't know, like that's kind of the thing. It just didn't work the same way, but the work continues. So, right, like there still was an acknowledgement because Director Harley Harper did oversee the EOC that, hey, this is our person on gun violence. So let's have this person lead the agency that was always intended to be the center point with the assistance of our office, right? Like appropriate kind of partnership and oversight of, hey, if you're having a hard time getting other agencies to participate, sometimes you do need a deputy mayor to work together on that. I'm just gonna say it's a fact, right? We've seen it with our task forces that is the role of a deputy mayor's office. And so we believe that continuing to build ONES will help us to get the traction that we need.
So as you think about helping empower ONES and others to have the data they need to demonstrate efficacy of their programs, what are your plans to ensure that data is being tracked for success in following participants, 6 months, 2 years out of services, and how is that data going to be shared both with the committee but also with the public?
So one of the fundamental things that needs to happen at ONES that we're working on is what you've heard. Like, let me say for others, we got to fill critical positions, including a data analyst. But that doesn't mean, I'm just going to be honest with you, that the data doesn't exist. The data does exist. Our office, as the deputy mayor's office, is responsible for tracking data on prevention programs, and we do, right? And so where we have fallen down is making sure on a consistent basis that we're sharing it publicly, and we're like looking to find a vehicle for that. ONES updated their website once, but again, like they don't have an IT person. These are very practical things. So happy to share with the committee and honestly the public the data that DMPSJ tracks, because regardless of whether an agency is in a position to track data, it's important that we do. So it does exist. And so the work that we'll do to get ONES to be regularly putting out data is the first thing is to make sure that we're helping them to hire an appropriate data analyst, right? And that is like some of the focuses. ONES started 5 years ago, and in many respects, it was like a startup. You're starting an agency from scratch. Now that we're 5 years in, it's important that we have what agencies have, right? Like they need to fill some infrastructure positions so that they're in a position to do things like produce data independent of our office on a regular basis. But until they do, and maybe even after, it's our responsibility to track. We track ONES and we track CURE, not for any other reason that it's important for us to know are these significant investments yielding, or what types of outcomes are they yielding? And that's true no matter who administratively runs a program. So what you can expect is we're like looking for, how do we do that? Is it on our website? Do we build in a data place there? Regardless of where it is, we will be releasing data on a regular basis. And it is a focus for me to have all of our agencies do that, because sometimes it's not, there's no intent to withhold. It's that they have all of this information and don't think of put this out.
And what I'm happy to hear that that's going to be a priority for you. Is there a timeline that we can expect that data will be shared?
So we're in the process of building our website. Like, we've worked with Octo since the fall. So our website should be launching soon, and there'll be a data tab where you can find that. With ones, I can't say, because, we need to actually hire a data person, but it is in relatively short order that you will start to see those data pieces. We were
Okay, but when it comes to your website, are we thinking a couple weeks, a month?
I think if we're like, I don't want to say a couple weeks, but within the next, probably, I would say 90, less than 90, greater than 30.
Less than 90 days.
Yes.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about gun violence and our youth challenges. I want to ask you about this kind of other category of cases where we have residents who are in need of additional mental health supports or are in crisis. How do you think of your role in connecting with others in the mental health services cluster and the community behavioral response team, and making sure that there's an appropriate partnership with MPD? Because I continue to hear both from behavioral health outreach workers and MPD officers that there is a disconnect sometimes in who is responsible for what, and then what happens after the initial call is made to make sure that that person is provided the services that they need and that the community is kept safe.
Yeah, so there's multiple levels in which we're involved. Like, first, the partnership between OUC, DBH, and MPD is a critical one, right? Because the determination of how calls are dispatched, it does certainly start at OUC. And so we are working very hard on a couple different levels to strengthen the DBH alternative response, because we have only diverted a very small number of calls, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is there's not an intuitive nature to the OUC dispatch protocols right now, and we're working on bringing in a system that will create more algorithms, and quite frankly, that will automate some of what is diverted. Because for the OUC call taker, they're going through a whole host of questions, and then at the end they make a determination. Oftentimes a resident doesn't want the alternative, right? And so they're going back and forth. Whereas with some algorithms built in, it takes away and has more intuitive decision making, where we can program in with all our alternatives, whether it's DDOT, DPW, or the DBH alternative. You program it, and so it automatically will start to cause dispatch to go in a certain way. That's one thing. We also have gotten technical support. That program, the DBH program, was accepted into the Harvard Kennedy, one of their programs, to offer technical support to help us strengthen the partnership, the training, because the truth is that some of the dispatch comes with fear. It's sometimes not altogether clear whether this is a public safety issue or a pure mental health issue, which does drive there is that human element of the fear, which is driving some of the dispatch. There is MPD and DBH are working on some training protocols between the two of them to help strengthen that partnership. They're going to be doing a pilot where they do a one-to-one. So if a mental health professional goes out, MPD will match up one-to-one, which will help without a larger response, right? So that they're co-dispatching, but in a way that will help both sides to more appropriately determine the best way to proceed in that space. Then on the sort of the larger scale, there's obviously the discussions between Director Bazrod and Dr. Bebout and myself and our agencies about how we can work better together, get more impact on the dispatch side, and obviously the follow, making sure people are connected to the right services. I think it's all, again, too, becomes a work in progress, because if we're realistic, like, we have far more mental health needs than we have not resources, but mental health providers, which is a shortage across the country, where the pandemic created more of a demand for both mental health services and alternatives to police, but less of a supply, right, of individuals to do it. And so, we're working on ways like first of all, making sure that we're dispatching appropriately, so we're utilizing the resources we have, and then going from there.
Okay, and then following dispatch, for residents who are having a mental health crisis and need kind of sustained interventions and supports, what do you see as the best path forward? Because it seems at the moment that there is not a plan for people who need more consistent supports, or who may be refusing supports, but are in this kind of middle category of also causing public safety challenges to others.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge because the case, right, like, there's the part of it that certainly public safety owns with public safety challenges, but how the mental health sort of case management, I will say it is further out of my lane than the public safety space. When it comes to individual issues or individuals who we know are having mental health challenges that are causing sustained public safety, those are conversations we have. I think I use an example of our encampments, right? Like, these are very, very challenging. It's challenging, right, to determine, okay, what is mental health and what is too much public safety issues that cause the public safety cluster to have to say, hey, listen, we're at a level of public safety challenge that requires a real acute intervention. And so I would love to say that there's these clear pathways we have, but we don't have them. They're extremely difficult issues in a time where the demand far exceeds, our ability to address every issue that comes up. I can say that, there are discrete mental health issues that our office is working on, whether it's, a big issue for us is the expansion of juvenile mental health and acute psychiatric care, which is a shortage. There's a lot of complex and challenging issues we're working across. And so I can't say sitting before you that, we have formulated a plan how to address that ongoing challenge. It is a gap. And I think it's one of those discussions that are we have to talk more with our colleagues in DMHHS and the behavioral health space about how to fill that.
Okay. Well, I ask you to stay focused on that because that continues to be a concern. And, I could list you off a dozen cases just in the last couple of weeks of severe public safety challenges that have been presented to various communities across DC, serious weapons that have been found, and the police response or the judge's response in some of those very egregious cases with extremely dangerous weapons and behavior and activity has been, well, it may be a mental health challenge and therefore there's nothing we can do about it. And that's the category that I want to make sure we're working towards a plan, because we can't kind of shrug our shoulders and say it doesn't squarely fall within either bucket and therefore no one covers it. So look forward to working with you on that. I do just want to ask you, before I move back to my colleagues, you talked about some more interaction with Cure the Streets in the Office of Attorney General's outreach workers. How are you working with them specifically to make sure that the clients they're working with have access to the wraparound support services and other government resources from the executive's perspective?
I mean, so I'll admit that there is challenge there, right? Because this is one of the kind of things about the structure of CURE being in the Office of the Attorney General is, there isn't the direct connectivity with all of the host of services and supports. I think there's long been a relatively good relationship at the kind of the street level, honestly, between CURE the Streets and WUNS. We are trying to systematize that more through joint meetings, right? Like I've participated recently in meetings that we've had in different communities where there are CURE ones and quite frankly, credible messengers to try and coordinate, because oftentimes, to be honest with you, in a number of our communities, the left hand does not speak to the right. And so there is a lot of services and supports being offered, many duplicative. Those type of very sort of grassroots weekly conversations are part of what will help us to best determine how to systematize that. But the challenge of having two different administrative structures and things like that, that's all. I think as long as we continue to have programs that are kind of all over the place, you will face those challenges. And the best that we can do is the process that we're going through right now of really looking at the entire continuum and being like, what's the model? Is there a way to operationally bridge any gaps in service delivery? But some of I think there's an ease now. My hope is that with the new Attorney General, there's ability to work. There was tension, right? Like previously between the executive and the Office of the Attorney General that I do think hindered the ability at a higher level to work together to make sure those services and supports were there. And so my hope is, we're all new, right? Like, so that there will be maybe some of that removed that will help us to more systematically operationalize that versus just kind of on the ground street level.
Okay, thank you. All right, Councilmember Lewis George, if you're here, I'll give you another 15-minute round. We'll do one more 15-minute round. And then if there are kind of follow-ups, we can do a shorter round afterwards. Because then we have to move on soon to the Office of Attorney General. And we have I think almost 50 public witnesses there. So Councilmember Lewis George, if you are still here, give you a minute. All right, Councilmember Parker, you're in luck. Cut the line, go ahead with the 15-minute round.
Thank you. I want to come back to the conversation around coordination, and then this time I want to talk a little bit about papering cases. And so there was a bit of a discussion earlier around the high rates of cases that are not being papered. And just for those that may be tuning in, and can you just classify what you think are the reasons behind that?
I can't say, right? Like, so because papering decisions are not made by the executive, right? Papering decisions are made by the prosecutors, either OAG on the juvenile side or USAO on the adult side. And so, I would hate to speculate on their reasoning why they're not papering cases. So I don't question that they have them. If that is outside of my decision-making authority.
So on the adult side, can you speak to the coordination that is currently underway to ensure that either more of the right cases are being papered or fewer of the wrong cases are ending up at the U.S. Attorney's Office?
I don't know what the right or wrong is, right? Like, I think our role in the executive is to enforce the law, right? So, MPD to arrest when they believe that there's probable cause to do so, and to do everything that we can to ensure that what's presented are the types of cases and the level of evidence that will allow the U.S. Attorney's Office on the adult side to make whatever decisions they're going to make on papering or, the prosecutorial decisions throughout. That's the only piece that we really control.
Yes, but part of the narrative that we constantly hear from the executive, respectfully, is that a large part of the issue in the district is that so many cases are not being papered, and or particularly with juveniles. This narrative, and it's permeated everywhere across the district that I'm at ANC meetings, and you have residents that would say, well, crime is out of control because either the old AG or this office is not holding juveniles accountable. And so it just is surprising that there wouldn't be more of an effort to coordinate, if that is truly what the belief is, to ensure that we can increase the amount of cases being papered or decrease the amount of cases showing up either at the Attorney General's office or the U.S. Attorney's office.
So I need to just correct something. The executive actually, we very rarely have said much about papering specifically. So I understand I'm an attorney, so the specificity matters. That when we speak about accountability, that can mean a broad range of things, but we have not necessarily specifically opined on the percentage of papering or lack thereof. I do believe that what we can say on juvenile side is the number of cases that proceed to commitment, that in fact, the acuity or how serious the offenses are for many young people in this past year, their first offense was, it was a higher percentage of violent offense. And we have seen increases, overall decreases collectively in juvenile arrests, but increases in some critical categories like carjacking or otherwise. But we have not seen a corresponding increase in commitment, right? Our commitment numbers continue to decline. So the middle portion we don't own, right? Like we present the case and then there is a adjudicatory process by the Office of the Attorney General, juvenile side in the court, that the district, the executive doesn't really have the ability to say much about. But what we do is participate in this Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, working together with our partners to determine are there areas that are under our purview that we can improve.
Two things, but let's, and many would push back on what was just stated, but let's accept that as fact or the case. Going back to coordination, if you are feeling as though young people are not being committed, as you put it, or held accountable, on the district's public safety side, what is being done to account for that? Or is it just is it finger pointing to say you all should have committed more juveniles who are breaking the law?
No, I don't think it's finger pointing. I think that everybody has to own the parts of the system that they own, right? So on the executive side, right, like we will own our responsibility, but I think it's always important for our residents to understand who is responsible for each part of the system, because accountability, whether for our residents, our juveniles, those committing offenses, us as a government, is a collective thing. So,
that's right.
So creating clarity of where people reside in the system is important. That being said, we have always said that our goal is, whether committed or not, is to serve young people who need help, whether that's through safe passages, whether that's through one's leadership academy, which we've expanded, whether that's through the expansion of services and supports that the achievement centers that D.F.S has extended far beyond committed youth, to the creation of programs that we're working on to expand services and supports that D.F.S offers to even non-committed youth. The executive is doing, is owning that these are our young people, and we're going to offer them and their families support wherever we find them.
Got it. And just to clarify, the Attorney General's office is determining whether or not to paper. It is the judiciary that is determining the release.
So it depends. So like the release, like, so if you're talking about secure detention decisions, there's like complicated, but secure detention decisions are made by the court. That's correct.
I get this, and I have questions for the Attorney General's office, because there are real questions around what are we doing to rehabilitate youth that may be moving down the wrong way. I'm not oblivious to what's happening on the streets. I guess what is troubling for me is, and I'm coming back to coordination, if we know, or if we accept that young people are not being committed, papered, whatever the case may be, the question then is, how are we as a system, a city, accounting for that? and maybe that's an unfair expectation, but I would like to be part of that discussion around how are we going to compensate if that is really what we believe? Because what I'm hearing in community meetings and from neighbors is the narrative that we're talking about, and they're very clear on the different parts and who's responsible for what, but they are still concerned about the direction that the city is going. And a lot of this, for me, comes back to a lack of coordination across all fronts.
So let me say this. So we met, the mayor called a meeting with principals, right, of middle schools, high schools, and for our charters and our DCPS schools. And there was real concern. And like one of the key things people wanted to know is who do we call, like we have young people who we know are at risk. We know these things are going, who do we call? Where's that person? And what I said in our office, stepped in and said is, it's us, right? And so we are working on creating clear, and we have a number of communication channels that we have established through safe passages, through, we have a juvenile critical incident protocol whenever a young person is involved in a shooting or a stabbing or an incident within 500 feet of a school, that kicks in a whole host of people beyond even just public safety agencies, but we do coordinate it, CFSA, right? DME, Deputy Mayor for Education, DCPS, because like I said in my testimony, the unique nature of juveniles is that there is so many different entities around them that when you talk about coordination for us as the executive, we're like, whether a young person's arrested or otherwise or not, if there's any sort of an incident we become aware of, we are going to offer services and supports in this wraparound fashion that I just described. And it's very much like, it's incident by incident, because that's how we have to build out this, the system. But I say that because, right, we don't ask, is that young person going to be committed? Are they arrested or otherwise, before we're like, okay, who knows this young person? Who are their friends? Do we need to have VIs? Does anybody know them? Let's go to the school. And we've been doing that work since November, and it's effective, right? We have had less retaliatory shootings amongst juveniles. And that doesn't ask the question of, are they going to be committed? What's happening with, it's right now, this thing happened. Something happened at school today, right? We need to step in and make sure that nothing else happens that we're wrapping around this young person. And so that's part of the process that essentially the mayor was like, listen, in November, we need to address this. And that was the process we came up with. It also is why we brought in the consultant in Clint to help us look at, hey, we have all these things in the continuum. No matter what happens, if a young person doesn't make their way to commitment and get a credible messenger, we have this whole continuum of services and supports. How can we be coordinated now in recognizing kids aren't getting committed? So here's how we utilize whatever we have in our toolkit to address them. So there's the dual level of we're doing, and then we're also planning to build out the system.
Okay. I just would, so there is an example that comes to mind of a young person that was accused of breaking law. I'm gonna say it that way, relative to someone's property. And they were not papered in that case. The same individual or young person was accused months later, same young person at that same property. And while I appreciate the discussion around supports taking place since November, the property owner didn't want the young person arrested. And it's my understanding that the young person was then picked up by their parents. But what seems to be missing in that gap of this first incident from the second incident is that either our system as a city, we don't know about that young person, nor did that young person receive supports. And so I will follow up after this just so I can learn more, but
yeah,
we need to figure out what is the support that is happening so we don't have to incarcerate more of our young people, because I would just say there are many of us that don't believe that that is the solution.
Can I just stop you though? Just incarceration is not, the district has one of the premier, I sort of stop because I bristle at the language. We don't believe in incarcerating young people. And, you know, over years and years.
To be fair, some people are suggesting that we should.
Okay, when we talk about commitment, D.F.S, the large bulk of young people who are committed to the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services they don't go to a secure facility, but when they do, we have worked extremely hard over decades to have, in fact, a premier juvenile justice system. I say that because I know, having been there 9 years, there are hundreds of workers at New Beginnings, right? Even our secure facility, PsyDs, people who have spent their careers really trying to figure out how you show love to a young person in a critical and difficult spot in their life, and how you do it in a space where they have committed criminal conduct. And even if they're securely held, which we, again, don't incarcerate young people in the district, that they receive the love, support, and care, and their family does as well, so that they don't recidivate. And I have to say that because on behalf of the more than 500 employees at D.F.S who really have committed their lives, many of them over decades, to being in facilities at time when young people are in some of the most challenging times of their life, to provide the type of love and support that will help them. I say that because I hear it a lot, and I just want them to hear from me, like, we appreciate that they believe also in rehabilitation, which is why we have a Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services versus an alternative.
Yes, which is also why I started my line of questioning with the programming and supports that are being provided with our young people that are incarcerated at DC jail. But this isn't a criticism of those working within the system, but this is a criticism, I guess, of the system itself, that we are not doing enough to support young people. And what I'm offering in that example is that young person was not apprehended, was not committed, was not papered, and there was nothing that happened. Now, that is not to point the finger at you, but it is that we—
I hear you. Agreed. It's a gap.
There is a gap that we—
Yeah, it's a gap.
And the narrative that I'm concerned that I hear a lot when I go to community meetings is, oh, it's that person, is this former elected leader's fault, is that agency? And I want us to move beyond that to think about how do we plug these gaps. So I appreciate that. Last thing I would just say, and it's an invitation, I got an email yesterday about the number of lights. And this is very simple, but the number of lights that are out in Trinidad, in Ward 5 in particular. And I will welcome you or someone from your team to ride around with our team to identify how can we address these things that could lead to increased crime, not just in Ward 5, but across the city.
Sure, and you can reach out, and we'll gladly do that. Obviously, like, one of the things that we do it's part of why we do the walks, is to be able to identify some of those things and work with our partners in DDOT or otherwise. We do believe just, in CPTED, which is crime prevention through environmental design, and things like that are important. So happy to connect with you on that.
That is my time. Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Parker. All right, Deputy Mayor, let's talk about federal funding. There have been a number of programs that we received federal funding for over the last several years, including for our violence prevention work. And some of that federal funding is going to run out or stop. Do you all have a plan on how to fill those gaps to support our violence prevention work without the federal assistance?
We do. So obviously there is the ARPA cliff we talk about, but certainly going in and determining how some of the funds would be apportioned. There was thinking, at the start of when the planning was made on some of the programs, we know we're going to have to continue with local dollars. That was part of the planning at the beginning. Certainly not all of them. Like some of the process we'll be looking at. How do these programs do? What would the outcomes? Do we want to continue them in some form or fashion? But there was absolutely, particularly in our space, and since so many investments were made in gun violence, in preparing for when FY26. I think the funds go through most of them in this space through FY25. In FY26, what we will fund with local dollars. So yes, we have thought about and have done some planning around that. And certainly over the next fiscal year or two, we'll be doing evaluations to determine what others need to move to local dollars.
Okay, thank you. Going back to our conversation of youth, kind of stepping back in the timeline before an arrest happens. And I talked briefly about earlier today this data that Chief Conti continues to share around the first incident of arrest being involving guns or more violent crime, when we didn't used to see that. And that kind of runs in contrast to the theory that we've been hearing about the smallest number of individuals in the city being responsible for the most violence and kind of addressing those specific city blocks. And so how are you reconciling those two seemingly inconsistent data points as we think about a path forward?
I still think that they're consistent, right? Like, it's still a relatively small number of people, whether adults or juveniles, who are responsible for significant or for a significant amount of our gun violence, or people very directly linked to them. Because in fact, in our city, a lot of our gun violence is crew-based violence, right? Is neighborhood beefs and disputes. That being said, right, like, they're absolutely, even with overall, right, like, even juvenile arrests have gone down, right, like, significantly in the past fiscal years. So that proves out that as our number of arrests go down, we do end up with maybe some more acute individuals that on adult and juvenile side. So, you know, there has been some, it's still a relatively small number, right, who are causing the most amount of pain for our communities. But we definitely acknowledge, and what you've heard us say is that we do have to look at our juveniles, because there has been a shift in the past couple of years that, you know, looking at, we think the pandemic has accelerated some of it, where this, and also the ready available of guns, that, like, we just have so many guns that have led us to a place where there is a little bit less of an escalation with juveniles, right? It used to be kind of, you know, you work your way up and there's a greater number that are just kind of leapfrogging up. So, but I think the chief would agree when we say, like, you have to look overall, arrests for juveniles are down. And so it's still a relatively small number, but too great of a number, and a troubling number when it comes particularly to juveniles.
Okay, and I want to grapple with the effects of having kids in the criminal justice system. And you've said that spending time in the system can sometimes be the best thing for kids. But one of the recommendations of the Gun Violence Reduction Strategic Plan says, and I quote, "Involvement in the system, and particularly secure detention, is well established to have lasting negative effects on kids, including increasing the risk of adult incarceration." So what is your philosophy on that dichotomy, and how are you thinking about additional ways to reduce the negative impact on our kids who are in juvenile detention?
Yeah, so it absolutely has been long studied that, right, like, involvement in the juvenile justice system, right, like, it can lead to further involvement in the criminal justice system. I think the way that I sort of resign this, my philosophy is that we don't want young people committing crime. We don't want them involved in risky behavior. And so, you know, starting when they're very, very young, we have to do the work of working with our educational partners to identify and to provide supports much earlier, right? That will, when we've identified that potentially a young person's at risk for continued involvement. That being said, it also was very important to us because of that fact. I often say we have to talk about the district as itself, because not every juvenile justice system is created equally, right? There are many jurisdictions where you go where it is child prison. Like, you basically are teaching young people to survive incarceration, which is why we've been very careful in the district that when we do secure detention, that isn't what we're creating. That this is not a correctional facility, and it's even why we changed our frontline workers to be called youth development representatives, because from day one of commitment or involvement in secure facilities, it's thinking about how to move them through and get them out. And as a result, D.F.S has a relatively low recidivism rate, right? Like, I think it's it ranges it's in like the mid 20% or so of young people recidivate over time, right? And that's post commitment, which means longitudinally, right, like we can look at down the line, but we also have to look at our city. Is the way in which we do juvenile rehabilitation, which, you know, is it keeping our young people from recidivating? And it seems to be. So my philosophy would be like, we need to do all the things we've talked about to prevent, to make sure they have loving, caring adults, that their needs are met, that they're going to school, because truancy is a big precursor, that we're doing all of that, but that when they do engage in criminal conduct, that we say, and I've said this, like I came from a place where we asked, what does love look like in public policy? And it looks like what a parent would do. If your child is involved in risky behavior, sometimes you do sit them down, you do ground them, you do those things that will help to save their lives and others. And right now, you know, we had 105 young people shot last year. We are trying to save their lives. And if that means that we have to sit them down and put them in a place where they're provided with the mental health supports, school, right? Like all of the things that they can't engage with when they're thinking about their neighborhood or their crew dispute or otherwise, then that's what we need to do.
Moving on to the next kind of stage of the life cycle for our returning citizens. A week or two ago, I was at the oversight hearing for the Mayor's Office of Returning Citizens Affairs. And folks there identified housing as the #1 need. And that is a continuing piece of feedback that I hear from returning citizens or people who are preparing themselves to leave the DC jail and don't necessarily know where they're going to go or what that's going to look like. How are you working to increase the number of people that we're able to provide housing support so that we don't see those folks become unhoused upon release?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously we have the allotment of a certain number of housing vouchers that MORCA has through the Housing Authority. And obviously there will never be enough to meet the need, because I think we all know in our city housing is one of the most critical needs. And a challenge for returning citizens is even where we're able to provide vouchers or housing assistance, there are many landlords in the District of Columbia where you know, you apply, and if you have a criminal record, you will not be accepted. So that's a challenge. One of the things that we're discussing, because, you know,
which is illegal, we should just clarify.
Yeah.
Right.
But a reality we face, right? Like, and which limits the ability or limits the locations often where people are then able to obtain housing. Like housing will always be, like, we're working as fast and as hard as we can as a city, right? To increase our supply of housing, because that's part of the issue. We are having discussions about what are creative other ways that we can work that aren't solely the DC Housing Authority. We do know that we have some property owners who are willing to work with us on a person-by-person basis. And while that doesn't sound like a system, sometimes that's what the work is case by case trying to identify, while we increase on a system level the amount of housing supply, because I think you're going to hear, whether it's returning citizens, mental health consumers, or just any other resident of the district who needs housing support, like we just, you know, we're not in a position where we have enough for everybody. And so there's the part of making sure that we're funding as many vouchers within DC Housing Authority as we can. And then also working with, property owners and otherwise who are more, and there are wonderful property owners who are really willing to work with us to find housing person by person, if that's what we have to do right now.
Okay. And I think that's another place that your office can be particularly useful in making sure that the data we're tracking is consistent. It was my understanding from the questions that I asked in that hearing that there is not a consistent set of metrics that MORCA is using to determine success of, 6 months, 2 years. And if that is all consistent with the other programs that you're overseeing, I think we'll all be benefited. Can you talk about how the district supports women who are incarcerated, the vast majority of whom are mothers, and how we're working to ensure incarcerated mothers remain connected to their children?
I mean, so one of the challenges, right, is that we don't have significant numbers of women at the DC jail. I think if I were to pull today's population, which I looked at earlier, our numbers of women at the DC jail are relatively low, but when it comes to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, I think one of the challenges we would say all the way across the board is not having our own prisons here means that remaining connected or otherwise can be a challenge. So our work with CIC, right, to make sure that our residents across, the Corrections Information Council across the country are being taken care of becomes important. And it becomes more important upon with our reentry planning. But I would say probably a gap or a challenge is our continued relationship with FBOP and trying to build relationship such that we're able to connect with our residents no matter where they are. It is challenging, right? Because we don't determine where residents are going and they're across the country, right? And retaining that kind of the relationships it's not as easy as if we had our own facility here in which, because we value obviously the relationship that women have with their children, that we were able to maintain that. And so we're continuing to work with FBOP, and we have found a bit of a better, right? Like we have gotten to a place where at least we have a little bit better communication. But I think whether it's education or, women's issues, right? Like it is a work in progress because of our posture of not having the ability to say where our residents are going and then having them oftentimes so far from home.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you. And I think, I've been trying to improve the situation with our nutritional standards at the DC jail for all people who are living there. And one of the issues, and I have a bill called Fresh Starts to do that, to make sure that there's more nutrition and fruits and vegetables offered. But one of the things that I've heard from women who are there is about the not only lack of access to healthy foods, but the lack of understanding of kind of what their body needs, particularly when they're on their menstrual cycle. And I just want to be more proactive about the different needs of women who are incarcerated in a system that was largely modeled for men as we move forward. Can you provide an update on the work of the Ready Center at DOC and how your team plans to support their work?
Yeah, and so obviously through the pandemic, it was most of our services were shut down. The Ready Center opened or like restarted middle or sometime like I think it was fall of last year. Meeting at the Reeve Center because location is a challenge, and we had explored all sorts of different types of location. Can we do a trailer? Can we, right? Like there needs to be some level of accessibility of the location as well. So there's so many considerations that go into that. But we got started and work was underway. Dr. Lopez leaving, obviously, again, I mentioned before, sort of she was overseeing it. It didn't set us back, but obviously like transition always kind of, you take a minute. But we're full steam ahead and really working to make sure that there's a little more integration with DOC and MORCA, right? That we're not duplicating efforts and that they're really connected in and that there's the appropriate handoff between what's happening at the Ready Center and MORCA. And then we're also working on a location. I think we've identified a space within district portfolio that will give them a great footprint and we're working with DGS on finishing that up and when DOC can get in there. Because that'll be I think that's a big thing is having a location where people can go. That's going to be in Ward 8, which will also be really helpful. And so we're continuing to move. The main thing too is like the relational piece between DOC and MORCA and making sure that MORCA is always linked in everything that we do for our returning citizens, but particularly in the work with the Ready Center. So we've been working on that connectivity.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's helpful and look forward to partnering with you on that. I do just want to raise a few items that came up from our public witnesses,
sure.
Particularly around Medicaid funding and using that funding for violence interruption work as recommended by the White House. And Rachel Usden from Peace for DC was talking about some of the other states that have been effective there. I'm curious what your thoughts are there. And for local control of our parole board and seeing if we have your commitment to working towards that goal.
Yeah, and so I mean that's a very interesting. Listen, we're willing to explore all funding sources, and so I think what the most interesting sort of idea, because there's I mean it's not a ton of states, but obviously we're willing to explore anything. But is the HVIP idea, because we do fund in 6 hospitals, and so that's a space certainly I'm willing to have conversations with Deputy Mayor Turnage, who also heads healthcare finance, because you know, we are committed to finding all funding sources that we can for all of our programming, but certainly that would seem to be an interesting fit with the HVIP, and so have my commitment to have continued conversations with him on that. On parole, you know, so I was very much involved in all the work we've done around parole, and we're committed to advancing it. I think one of the things that I will say, and with working, you know, with Dr. Moyd and with Professor Moyd and Michelle Bonner, like we believe in working with local experts. I will say, and I think that one of the things people don't necessarily know is one of the challenges that we faced is, and this is kind of true across our work, is that as was mentioned, you know, there are a couple of models we presented as options. We did a lot of work with Ms. Bonner and Professor Moyd as options, and there really was no consensus. And the issue that we have then with moving forward as the executive is that council, you know, obviously has to pass legislation, and the courts, while they don't necessarily have to agree, there was a feeling that the executive was foisting responsibility on the courts in a time where everything we've described before is a reality. Diminished judges, and if they're getting more work, you know, that was an issue for them. And so we kind of ran into a little bit of a feedback loop of how we move forward, because it's not the executive just set something up, because we know very well it's important that the stakeholders, you know, we may not get to a full place of agreement, but that at least we're able to move some legislation forward. And that just was not in a place where we were, right? Like, so the executive essentially had done all the legwork we could on office space, all of those things, but without really a little bit more agreement on what the model should be, and what then legislation we advance or otherwise, we became stuck. And that's where we found ourselves. So that people know, because that is really some of what happened, is just like a lot of things in the district, people have very differing ideas. And, you know, when actually there was some upsetness, and I'll tell you from other stakeholders, that the executive had gone ahead. People felt that the executive had just gone ahead and done this thing, when really we were just trying to do some pre-work to bring some potential models. So that was some of the—
When you say some people were upset, you mean the courts?
Oh, it was not just the courts. We did this presentation to CJCC, and there were various stakeholders who were like, you're just coming to us telling us what we're going to do. But we had worked with, you know, like I said, with our consultants, and wanted to present some options of models, because starting from scratch and just being like, what are we going to do? We recognized there was like a time frame that was really tight to get all of these different moving parts through federal legislation, local legislation, regulations. And so we kind of stepped back and we're like, okay, like, let's have a collective conversation around what we should do. And then we sort of found ourselves in this place where people were like, well, we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. No, and, you know, like, respectfully, it doesn't usually work very well for us to then just be like, council, here's legislation, when I think reasonably so, council recognizes that various stakeholders are like, well, we don't think that's the right one, and we don't think that's the right one. So, but yes, we'll go with this thing you executive have presented to us. I mean, I don't know. It didn't seem like that was going to be a successful way of really getting us where we needed to go. So.
Okay, well, thank you for that context from your perspective, and definitely looking forward to working with you on that over the next year and several years, to make sure that we're taking all the steps that we can to get not just local control of our parole, which I think is really important, but more local control of our criminal justice system, so we can address a lot of the gaps that you've highlighted today. So thank you so much, and congratulations again. Thank you for being here, and thank you for all of our public witnesses. I'm happy that we've been able to have a kind of robust discussion today about a lot of the pieces in the life cycle in our public safety toolkit, whether that's additional interventions and supports for our young people, how we can support them in the process and support the whole community in the process of everything from arrest to trials and hearings to conviction, to serving sentences and our returning citizens. And all of those pieces working in concert are very important, and of course, squarely in your role. And so looking forward to working with you over this year. So we are going to take a 5-minute recess. Upon returning, we're going to hear from our public witnesses for the Office of the Attorney General. I do want to note for those following along that this hearing will no longer be streamed on channel 13, and you may continue following the hearing on the DC Council's website or on our YouTube channel, which is at CM Brooke Pinto. That's at CMBROOKEPINTO. And it is 1:34, and we will re-adjourn at 1:40 p.m. Thank you.